Okay, it looks like everybody who is trying to log in has logged in, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. My name is Alan Lilly. I'm the presiding hearing officer for the State Water Resources Control Board's Administrative Hearings Office. Today is Wednesday, December 14, 2022. It's just after 1 p.m. And this is the continuation of my office's hearing on the court's reference to the State Water Resources Control Board in the case of City of Marina versus RMC Lonestar, Monterey County Superior Court, case number 20 CV 001387. It looks like all the appearances by attorneys and all of the expert witnesses are the same as before, so I'm not going to ask for people to go through those again. And I do appreciate you're all gathering this afternoon for this continuation of the hearing. So let me just dive in to the big issue that I see. And I'd like to talk with all of you first from the attorneys. And okay, Mr. Neudecker, go ahead. Your electronic and real hands are up. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Lilly. Since you mentioned appearances, I just wanted to mention to you and your staff that I need to leave about 3:45 or 4 o'clock today. So a colleague of mine named Siobhan Henry will be joining this Zoom about that time.
Okay, thank you for letting me know, Mr. Neudecker. I don't think we will be going that late, but if we do, that substitution will be fine. And of course, you will have an opportunity to review the recording of the remainder of today's meeting. So thank you for letting me know. Okay, so I want to just dive right in to the modeling issue. We have several housekeeping matters regarding exhibits and so forth to take care of, and we will. But the big issue that I asked for input on at the end of yesterday's hearing, Monday's hearing, and then in a follow-up email I sent yesterday, was basically how we go forward with, I'm going to say, the 2022 North Marina groundwater model. It may also include potentially the 2022 Salinas Valley groundwater model, and how it makes sense for CalAm's expert witnesses to go forward. And basically, now that they have seen what I'm going to call the critiques from the technical witnesses from Marina Coast Water District and City of Marina. And as I stated yesterday, my goal here, I mean, the ideal result would be for CalAm's technical experts to make revisions to the model parameters, model runs, calibration, and so forth, to the point where Marina Coast and City of Marina's experts said, okay, with those revisions, we do not have any significant disagreements. And therefore, we would have what I would call a consensus, or at least an accepted model that then CalAm could run, and the other experts could analyze the output files, as Dr. Kincaid did before with the last round of output files. And I think then I would be in a good position to answer the court's questions. Some of them, most of them rely on the modeling, not all of them, but most of them. So that would be ideal. That may or may not happen.
How's it going?
Oh, excuse me, Ms. Blanc, you better go on mute. We heard you.
Sorry about that.
Okay, thank you. I know you're trying to multitask since I give you so many assignments, but thank you. So the fallback, less ideal, but still perhaps acceptable result would be that CalAm's technical experts would make changes, and Marina Coast and City Marina's technical experts would have comments. They would say basically, we think we still have the following substantial concerns. And if possible, then at that point, I would ask the CalAm modelers to do what we'd call a sensitivity analysis to see how significant those concerns are in terms of the results. So that's the big picture of where we are. I appreciate the information on the prior models, but frankly, I'm particularly having heard the limitations of the superposition modeling approach. I don't see, I would not be comfortable relying very much on the prior modeling work. Now, there are the Weiss model results, which I think are useful to show how changes in assumptions about gradient, I think mainly in the 180-foot aquifer, affect things like the area of the capture zone. So there may be some relevance there, but obviously the 2022 modeling is the most recent modeling. It's not superposition, and particularly with this additional round of potential discussion and revisions, it's probably going to be the best tool for answering the court's questions. So anyway, that's my context. I did receive an email this morning from Mr. Osias, 8:59 a.m. I'm glad you met my 9 o'clock deadline. And most importantly, I appreciate the detail that you provided regarding potential additional technical work by CalAM's experts, and what I think is a vigorous schedule. And I certainly appreciate it if they can do this to complete this work and submit, I assume, a technical memorandum and model files to the AHO and the other parties by January 16. I know it's a lot of work. On the other hand, this is a model that they have spent a lot of time on already, so they're not starting from scratch. And I do note, Mr. Osias, you stated in your email something to the effect of you didn't want to presume that the AHO assumes that these are all defects in the modeling just because we asked the questions. I think I'm paraphrasing slightly what you said. Presumes that the question phrasing does not reflect decisions on such disputes and disagreements, but rather an effort to gain more clarity. And that is absolutely correct. It would not be fair for me to jump to conclusions on these issues before I've even heard responses from CalAM's technical experts. So I'm not intending to do that. I just wanted to get it out on the table. I got out my list of issues yesterday, and then you and your technical experts refined and elaborated on those, which I appreciate. So I'm going to just pause there for a moment, and I'm going to start with you, Mr. Osias, since you took the laboring oar here to prepare this list.
Mr. Lilly, just in the interest of fairness, I received a copy, I assume you did too, from Mr. Brochard of a list.
Uh-oh.
Thank you, David. Yeah, Mr. Lilly, the city and Marina Coast also forwarded an email to all parties at 9 a.m.
Well, 1 minute later, but
seconds after Mr. Osias.
Well, thank you. Thank you for letting me know, because I'm I'll be honest, I have not seen that. So, and it's probably my bad. I will say my staff did send that to me, and I just missed it in my email inbox. So I apologize for that, but I do want to be candid about that. So let me just see where we are. I'm going to pause. Let's just pause for just a minute here. I'm of the old school. I'm going to print the 2 pages that have your text and look at that. So just everybody just stand by for a minute. If we need to take a break, we will. But thank you for letting me know. And I apologize for that. I did get the file with Dr. Kincaid's own budget analysis. And unfortunately, I saw that and I thought it was just a transmittal email, and I didn't look down and read the text where you talked about the rest. So it's clearly my mistake. You did that. So let me just take a look at this here. Okay, so thank you, Mr. Asias and Mr. Brochard. So with that, and then my staff sent me a couple of questions, annotations on the list from Mr. Asias, which I will get to as well. So Mr. Asias, my questions, you just became a little broader. Do you have overall comments on what I just said? And also, do you have comments on Mr. Brochard's model? So let's start there and we'll go from there.
So a couple things. Thank you for acknowledging the comment I included in the transmittal about the wording of the questions and not to take anything from them. There is one of your questions, which I am sympathetic to and understand, but and believe perhaps there's some additional information that our technical experts can provide to you. But the premise of the question is quite difficult. In fact, it's speculative, and that's your question 4 and our topic 4 happen to be coincidentally the same subject matter, which is what will Sigma bring to the basin? If I'm paraphrasing now in a hierarchical way, and that is what will Sigma cause or produce in terms of changes to the basin in parameters relevant to modeling impacts. So I've been trying to be very general.
No, that's good. Go ahead.
The specific GSP, the 180-400 subbasin GSP has management actions and projects, and both those were alluded to by witnesses. You saw the list of projects. You heard from Ms. Nelson some management actions under consideration, but everything is still at a conceptual level in that plan. Something as basic to Sigma as demand management has a work plan. This isn't in the evidence, I apologize, but I can provide you a document if you need it. But for background at least.
No, go ahead. This is helpful.
The framework for demand management, the framework, which is sort of the policy level decision, won't be completed until June of 2024. So, and then as you heard, projects like the seawater intrusion barrier are being actively studied, but I can't tell you either when or how project implementation, or if, to be fair, project implementation would occur. Okay, so we don't believe that pumping reduction will be the only impact on the basin. And a decision about when, where, and how much pumping reduction will occur is going to be, in reality, and probably your experience as well as mine, a combination of science, price, cost benefit, and politics, which is a long way of saying we don't know. So the question that you asked in its wording, and even our topic, contemplates speculating. And so
sounds ominous, but go ahead.
Well,
I'm not criticizing you. You're
I'm trying to be
criticizing me with good reason. Go ahead.
If there's something you want to know about, assume X, what does it cause, or what's the result? our experts will be glad to engage with you today and with additional technical work to provide that information. So if you said, what's the impact on, pick whatever you wish, 10% reduction in historical pumping in the subbasin, they can model that.
Right.
There's no way they could opine, nor should anyone in this on this screen opine that that's mandated by Sigma, or required by Sigma, or included in a plan yet.
Well, or most importantly, whether or not it's likely to occur.
Right.
I
So,
understand.
I want to get to the difference between providing you and your team with more technical work that you believe will be helpful, but not pretend that we're opining about what's realistic or imminent or required or any of those things, notwithstanding some witnesses have expressed those kinds of opinions.
No, I appreciate this. This harkens back many years ago when I was in college. One of my professors, very good professor, said something to the effect of, sometimes it's important to think about what you're doing before you start doing it. And I think that's basically what you're saying here. These technical experts for these parties are very capable of putting in numbers and analyzing them, and frankly, they're capable of looking at the big picture too. But clearly, we need to look at the big picture before we just start grinding numbers. So while we're on that, I want to pursue that a little further. And, again, I'm sort of brainstorming here, but as I said, I don't want to wait until January. I'd like to keep this moving forward. As you know, I have specific directions to answer specific questions. So that's my goal. So Dr. Ye, I see you're here. Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? And you have to go off mute so I can hear you.
Yes. Good afternoon, Mr. Lady.
Yes. So it's good afternoon now. And I don't know whether this is exactly testimony, but I'll just give a reminder to you and all of the other witnesses who are on today. And first of all, thank you very much for all gathering here. But to the extent you do say things in this proceeding, you are still all under oath. And, of course, I have no question you're going to tell the truth anyway. But just a reminder, you are all under oath. So, Dr. Ye, and if we need to, we can put it up on the screen. But I think you'll know what I'm talking about. Your August 23rd, 2022 North Marina Groundwater Model Technical Memorandum. It's on in section 4, talks about the different model scenarios. You had scenarios 1, 3, 5, 6, 9, and 10. And there's a column called agricultural pumping. And as I say, I can pull up the table if we need to, but I'm pretty sure you know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Scenarios 1 and 3 say repeat 2019 pumping, 5 and 6 reduction of 2019 pumping by 50%, and scenarios 9 and 10 reduction of 2019 pumping by 30%. What is that ag pumping?
That is the agricultural pumping simulate by the regional model.
And is that throughout the Salinas Valley?
Yes, yeah.
So that would just assume to kind of, so I understand that every ag well that's modeled by Mr. Durbin's model, the pumping would be cut back by either 50% or 30%. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, good. That's what I thought, but I wasn't sure. So thank you for that clarification. And that's why now I'm going to go back to brainstorming with you, Mr. Osas. You want to brainstorm with me? Go ahead. Rate your hand.
Well, and this goes to sort of the process for today. So I'm very cognizant of trying not to talk over anyone, even in a brainstorming session, which is a habit I'm not good at. So
we all are bad at it, but go ahead.
Okay.
Your hand was up first.
So I do want to to the extent you permit it, sometimes call on one of the other experts. The pumping was from the regional model. It's a regional, the GSP is a regional question, going back to why I brought this up. And so I wanted to just make sure that Mr. Durbin, who was the author of the regional model and did the regional pumping reduction, whether he had anything to add to Mr. Ye or Dr. Ye's answer.
I'm going to get there.
Oh, okay.
Let me ramble on. And I saw your hand was up, Mr. Bouchard. So let me get to you. But I need to get a few questions out here. We're never going to get
Okay.
anywhere. So, and actually, maybe this will, I'm going to ask Mr. Durbin to do something that I know modelers hate doing, and that's to try to make some estimates of how changes in model parameters would change model results. And almost always the answer I get is, well, I'd have to run the model. But one of the things I thought about this morning that I'm concerned about is we have a whole bunch of subbasins. There are probably 5 or so subbasins within the Salinas Valley. And I know one of them is called the pressure subbasin, which is sort of, I'll say, upstream in the Salinas area, or no, excuse me, the Forebay subbasin. And I think it's called that because it has significant amounts of recharge into these aquifers. So I'm going to ask you, Mr. Durbin, and just state this qualitatively, and I'm not going to hold you to this because I know this is a complex question, but would changes in the modeled agricultural pumping in the other subbasins besides the 18400 aquifer subbasin and the Monterey subbasin, of course they would change the boundary conditions, but would they significantly change the boundary conditions for the North Marina groundwater model in a manner that would significantly change the results? If you can answer, and if you say you can't, I will understand.
I think that there would be little effect. Not to say there wouldn't be any. First of all, I want to make the regional model does go all includes Forebay area and the Upper Valley area. So changing pumping there potentially could allow additional stream flow to come downstream and therefore provide new opportunities for recharge. That would depend in part upon how the reservoirs, the 2 reservoirs might be reoperated. I mean, so it is a complex question, but I think the basic answer, I would be surprised if there was a significant effect.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that input. Again, I'm not holding that to you. And you just gave an important, just the reservoir reoperation comment is a significant comment that I'm taking note of. So let me go back, who either Mr. Durbin or Dr. Ye, I think it's one of you, but can you tell me why you did the scenarios with the 50% reduction in ag pumping and the 30% reduction in ag pumping? And I'll just say candidly, those seem unrealistically high. I mean, a 50% reduction in ag pumping in the Salinas Valley, I'm pretty sure would wreak economic havoc. So why did you do the scenarios, and even 30% would wreak, I'm sure, very significant economic havoc? So why did you, and therefore may or may not be realistic. So my question is, why did you do those pumping reduction scenarios? So I'll start with you, Dr. Ye, and if you want to, you can defer to Mr. Durbin.
Yeah, I will defer to Mr. Durbin.
Okay, Mr. Durbin, you're on the spot. Why did you do 30% and 50% pumping reduction scenarios?
So first of all, we were not trying to, or weren't constrained, didn't constrain ourselves by what was a plausible outcome. It was sort of exploring the magnitude of the problem in the valley regarding the seawater intrusion, and trying to just identify with some crude assumptions with regard to, changes in pumping in certain locations, what it would take to, at the coastline, have the seawater intrusion stopped. And that was the reason it was done, and we did a whole series of them trying to bracket where that might be.
Okay, well, that's helpful.
And Mr. Lilly, there's another answer, if I might chime in.
Okay, it's always dangerous when lawyers start testifying about groundwater modeling, but go ahead.
Well, it's not so much the modeling, but the result of the 50% reduction was about a zero gradient. And there was scenarios run with a zero gradient. And so part of the answer to your question is, well, if you were going to get to a zero gradient through pumping reduction, what would it be?
Well,
Okay.
That actually gets a little bit to what I wanted to address, Mr. Lilly.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Brochard. I hadn't called on you yet, but go ahead.
This is a question better put to the experts, but I'm not sure the 50% reduction did result in a 0% gradient. But I think with the effects of sigma, that's really what we should be talking about, is the change in gradient. Because sigma doesn't really, it cares about pumping, but it cares, at least in this basin in particular, I think it cares more about seawater intrusion as one of the main issues. And to stop seawater intrusion, you're going to have to change gradients. Whether you do that through a reduction in pumping or some other mechanism, the point is going to be to change gradients. And I think that's what Weiss was trying to model. And I think that's probably what needs to end up being modeled here. I don't know if a 30 or 50% reduction in this basin is realistic. I do know that is the plan in many other basins in California, are 50% reductions or more. If you want to get to sustainability, that's what's going to happen in a lot of areas. So I don't know if it's unrealistic.
Okay.
If it's going to happen, but I think for the purposes of what we're talking about here, I think we need to be talking about gradients.
Okay, well, I'll just say I disagree, although it may not be a complete disagreement. I think what the state board and the court want to look at is what are plausible Sigma implementation scenarios. I mean, I've read Sigma. I know pretty well what the goals in it are. I also know reality, and I'm pretty familiar with the groundwater and the historical seawater intrusion situation in the Salinas Valley. I mean, it's obviously a huge problem going back to the 1940s. And, the legislature can write laws and state goals, and I'm not criticizing them. Clearly they should and did, and that was the right thing to do. But what I think is my proper inquiry is not what would be a theoretical result if a statutory goal were met, which might or might not happen, but rather what are plausible scenarios for Sigma implementation. And I'm hearing pretty clearly that there's significant uncertainty regarding both. Ms. Nelson made the important distinction between what I'm going to call management measures and projects. And there's significant uncertainties about both, which I think she alluded to and others have as well. Now, if there's any good news in this, and I'll ask Mr. Durbin, since you started this discussion, I'll start with you, although this may shift over to Dr. Ye or maybe even Dr. Kincaid. I did get, and if you're wondering why I'm squinting, it's because I printed the entire summary page from from Exhibit MCWD 122, which I did receive from Mr. Brochard's email when I neglected to read the rest of his email. And I printed it, it's in fine print because I wanted to get it all on one page. But the first set of columns, the kind of first table on the left in the summary, in the spreadsheet, the summary tab, has the changes in pumping in the green, and it has for scenarios 1 and 3, for layer 2, layer 5 in total, and then for scenarios 5 and 6, for layers 2 and 5 and 2 plus 5 total. And I'm looking at the numbers, and there certainly are some changes from between the I'll say the 1 to 3 change versus the 5 to 6 change, but they are not very big. And frankly, I'm surprised. And I don't know, Mr. Durbin, if you can comment on that. I mean, scenarios 1 and 3 basically assume no change in agricultural pumping in the Salinas Valley, where scenarios 5 and 6 assume a 50% reduction in agricultural pumping in the Salinas Valley. So do you have any comment on why that, very, very significant reduction in agricultural pumping would have very small effects on the amount of seawater that's estimated to I'll say, intrude or infiltrate across these 5 zones into the land?
Well, of course, ultimately, it depends on any scenario. It depends on what the impacts of the gradients at the coastline are. And at this point, all I can say is that the scenarios as they were run had relatively little impact on that.
Okay. Well, I guess we'll leave it at that. I mean, that is a fact. The numbers don't lie. And I mean, it's just, I didn't calculate percentages, but I mean, they're just are very, very, very small changes. I mean, it looks like in the order of, even in the layer, in the reach 3, where the biggest amounts of seawater intrusion is, I'm just looking that the total under change for layers 2 and 5, going from scenario 1 to scenario 3, is 7,736 acre feet. And going from scenarios 5 to 6 is 7,816 acre feet. That's an increase, but not very much. And Dr. Kincaid, first of all, good afternoon. And second of all, if you can shed some light on this, I would appreciate it. So go ahead.
I think I can, and good afternoon to you as well, Mr. Lilly. I believe that what you're looking at there is going to be driven primarily by the project pumping, which doesn't change between the 2 different scenarios, because we're looking only at what's happening right at that, along that particular line through the model domain. So these values and budget changes, I think, are predominantly driven by the changes in the project pumping. But the big difference would be if you look at scenario 1 versus scenario 5. So scenario 1 in the that would be sort of a fair comparison of the 2 the 2 scenario conceptualizations, as opposed to looking at the relative changes between the sets, because that's going to be driven by the project pumping primarily.
Okay. Well, and that's a good point. I get that. So, okay. And so those are bigger changes. I mean, I'm looking here, the blue column, which is basically scenario 1 and scenario 5, for reach 3, the total of 2 plus 5 under the pre-pumping scenario 3 is an intrusion, as I see it, of 4,579 acre feet per year, where under reach 3 for pre-pumping, which is scenario 5, it's 3,442 acre feet per year. So that's a reduction of about 1,200 acre feet per year. So I agree, that's much more significant.
Yeah, and I didn't explore this particular question, but I would say that that's a better way to evaluate what I think you're getting at here, is the difference between the 2 different pumping scenarios as posed by Dr. Ye.
Well, yeah, I mean, what's relevant depends on what question we're trying to answer.
Yeah, exactly. Obviously.
I mean, the big question for me to answer is the impacts of the Calam slant well pumping on the seawater intrusion. So that's why the changes, and you've set it all out in your table very clearly. So that's why it's very small changes, even if the initial conditions are for pre-project under scenario 1 versus scenario 5 are significantly different. The changes induced by the project pumping still are almost the same.
Yeah, and I believe that's predominantly due to the proximity to the ocean, which is of course, nature of the project, and the ocean boundary doesn't change as a consequence of agricultural pumping.
Okay, well, thank you. While we're on that, I had an unrelated question, but since I've got you here, basically on the floor, let's go ahead with this one to have the floor. I looked at the far right column, and this is me trying to understand something that I don't understand very well. On your summary table, on the far right column, or the far right table, you have blue, orange, green, and yellow columns. And the green column here changed due to pumping. This is scenario 1 versus scenario 3. You have it for the 5 reaches. Of course, it's probably the biggest by far is in reach 3. But I totaled those up for all 5 reaches. I just did Excel sum, and I get 10,734 acre feet. That would be the additional seawater flow across the boundary into all layers, basically due to the project pumping. And what I was wondering, as I understand it from Dr. Ye's memo, the total pumping, project pumping, is 17,300 acre feet per year. So can you explain to me, and if necessary, I can shift over to you, Dr. Ye, although I suspect Dr. Kincaid, you can explain this. Why is the induced, or maybe I'll just say it another way, where does the other almost 7,000 acre feet per year of water come from in these, by going to the, between scenario 1 versus scenario 3?
So yes, I can explain that. And what you've identified is a flaw in the way that we posed the question. And if you if you have that spreadsheet that I sent you open, or if you allow me to share my screen, I can show you either way.
Well, I have it open.
Okay.
But it seems to work best if we have our staff screen share, but you can tell them what to do, so to speak. So
yeah,
I'll ask I mean, if I could put it up, but it's best if everyone sees it at the same time.
Okay.
So I'll ask my staff if you can screen share exhibit MCWD 122, which we just received this morning, but I'm pretty sure Mr. Anderson has already moved over to the MCWD exhibit file. Let's screen share that. And then Dr. Kincaid can tell us which tab to go to and which lines and so forth. So just give us a minute and we will do that.
One thing, if it's okay with you, I would, before we get too far away from the last discussion, you had asked Dr. Durbin a question about the
Mr. Durbin.
Mr. Durbin, sorry.
He's not a PhD, but he has over 50 years experience. So
it could be might as well then do that. But I believe one of the concerns that we had was that the changes in pumping didn't seem to be expressing the expected change in the boundary condition of the model. And I believe I understood you say that you didn't think that the changes in pumping would have a very large effect on the boundary conditions. And I just wanted to make sure I heard you correctly. And if not, if you could clarify that.
Yes.
So, go ahead, Mr. Durbin. That's certainly what I heard you say as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, I had presumed that we were talking about changes, reducing pumping further south in the valley in the forebay and upper valley areas. And so that answer was in response to that understanding.
Oh, okay. So we're going in a few different directions here, but let's stick with that. So, Mr. Durbin, when I asked the question, it was, would a 30% or 50% reduction in all agricultural pumping in the Salinas Valley, in other words, in all sub-basins, have a significant effect on the boundary condition? So if I wasn't clear, I apologize. Does that change your answer?
Only slightly in that the reductions in pumping in the further south parts of the valley most likely would have very little impact on seawater intrusion.
Okay, but so the reductions in pumping in the 180-400 foot aquifer subbasin in the Monterey subbasin. I know there's not as much ag pumping there, but those would have greater effects on these boundary conditions then, I take it.
Yes, the closer to the ocean, the more effect that it would have.
Okay, so I hope Dr. Kincaid, that at least clarifies your question, that
It
concern
does.
or question.
It does. Thank you.
So go ahead. We now have the exhibit MCWD 122, which is an Excel spreadsheet. And we have the summary tab, or at least part of it, up here. I don't know if we have to scroll back and forth to get it all, but do you want to
No,
stay in this tab or go to another tab?
if you could go to the first tab labeled ZB polygons,
Okay, let's click on that.
and then if you could, actually, it's almost there. If you scroll to the right in columns AR through BE,
Okay, well,
so you're basically there. And then if you scroll down a little bit, you can see the blue dots. Okay, so here, this is how I just said that we didn't pose this question to the model very well, thoughtfully enough. Let's put it that way. So here what you see is the polygon. The blue dots represent the cells in which pumping is assigned in the model in either layers 4 or 5. And what?
And just to clarify, that's agricultural pumping separate from the project.
No, that's the project pumping.
Oh,
So-
okay. Thank you for clarifying. Go ahead.
So this polygon is our kind of best guess representation of the beach. So we kind of posed it to separate the landward portion of the aquifers from the seaward portion of the aquifers.
And can you just clarify what model layer this is?
So this is actually a composite. It's a graphic representing how all models would, how we, we set up the question to be posed to all layers of the model.
Okay,
And
go ahead.
so what you can see is that the polygon kind of goes through the center of the pumping wells, and therefore some of the it's not really capturing all of the water that goes to the pumping wells in reach 3. In reaches 1, 2, 4, and 5, it is representing what crosses the polygon into the landward portion of the domain. But in reach 3, it's missing the well, you can see it's missing the bulk of the water that's going in that from west to east, because the whole polygon is west of some of the blue dots. So well, it's missing some of the dots right in the center of the cells and then to the left. So that's why you see the discrepancy that you identified. Well, I believe that to be the case.
Okay, so that almost becomes a nomenclature. Those other polygons, you may say, well, I didn't include them because that's not water that really crosses the sea land boundary. It's more going straight into the wells. Is that what you're saying? Or?
Yeah, that's right. So when we first posed this problem, we were focused only on what happens outside of the capture zone. And so we set up we kind of capitalized on the cells that are marked by the red dots, because we had already identified those cells and used them to run forward particle tracks. So we sort of recycled that data set to evaluate, to set up the question to say what happens outside of the capture zone. And then subsequent to that, we realized that it also tells us what comes in and goes to the wells. And but then we, at too late at this point, we realized that we hadn't set the polygon up enough such that it captures all of the water that the analysis captures all of the water that comes from the ocean and goes to the wells. So in essence, this spreadsheet or this analysis underestimates OWP. If we think about it that way, it underestimates what the OWP would be to the ocean water percentage of water being extracted from the wells.
Okay, well, I hadn't even gotten to thinking about OWP.
Yeah.
But I would like, it looks like we may be having more model runs anyway, but and frankly, these tables you prepared are very helpful to me to understand what's going on. But somewhere along the line, I'll probably ask you to do some update of that because, you know, and again, to get it in simple terms that I can explain to the board and the court, it would be nice to be able to say, okay, the
Yes.
model shows there's 17,300 acre feet per year of pumping. Here's where it comes from as far as these different reaches. So I'd like those numbers to total out, or at least be a lot closer than they are now.
Yes,
And
sir. I
I'm
understand
not
that.
criticizing you. You
No.
did a lot of work in a very short time here to prepare these tables, so I understand that.
Yeah, well, thank you. But I think that's the reason that you see the discrepancy.
Yeah, okay, well, thank you. That is helpful. So we're largely because of me, we're rambling a little bit here. But you can go ahead and take that down now to my staff. You can take down the screen share there and we'll go back to our tile view. So we were on the question of Sigma implementation. Oops, sorry. When I look at exhibits, then I have to adjust my screen. We were on the question of Sigma implementation, and Mr. Osias and frankly, Mr. Bouchard both correctly alluded to the fact that there are some very significant uncertainties regarding how Sigma is going to be implemented in the future. And I get that. So, but on the other hand, I have to prepare a report now. I can't wait 20 years until we see how Sigma is, I'll say, starting to be implemented. So the good news is I'm seeing pretty low sensitivity of the results we care about here, which are the impacts of the slant well pumping. There seems to be relatively low sensitivity of that to the amount of reduction in agricultural well pumping, which, at least from my simple point of view, is a surrogate for both Sigma management actions and Sigma projects, because they both presumably have the effect of changing the water balance in these subbasins due to, I'll just say, wells and other activities that are not associated with the project. So, I'm not, I guess I'm, again, thinking out loud here. I don't like the 30% and 50% scenarios for the reasons I just said. But clearly what I'm looking for here is a bracketing. You know, and unless somebody tells me there's a reason we can't use reductions in ag pumping as a surrogate for all Sigma implementation actions, it seems to me we could bracket this with, you know, sort of a, I'll say, least Sigma implementation case, and maybe that I'm just throwing out numbers, maybe that's 10%, maybe it's 0, and a most Sigma implementation, which might be 20 or 30%. And frankly, I think if we do that bracketing, from what I can see from the results, even for the 30 and 50% scenarios, we're going to be able to sort of take care of that issue as far as looking at our analysis of project impacts. We can state that different ways. So I'm going to go first to Mr. Wilkins. Your electronic hand was up, and then I'll circle back to you, Mr. Osai. So go ahead, Mr. Wilkins.
So I think we probably don't fully agree or with that analysis. And Ms. Nelson had raised her hand in physical hand while you were doing that. And rather than have me testify to why we may not be able to bracket it in terms of just pumping, I would ask when you're ready to at least call on Ms. Nelson, because she did raise her physical hand. Thank you.
Okay, so Ms. Nelson, on the specific question of, do you think it's appropriate to run two scenarios with different amounts of percent reductions in agricultural groundwater pumping to bracket the potential effects of Sigma implementation? What is your comment?
I don't think that utilizing the reduction in groundwater pumping across the Salinas Valley Basin is a good way of doing this. And I think that Mr. Durbin articulated why that is. And it is because to stop seawater intrusion, you would not reduce pumping across the entire Salinas Valley Basin by 50% or 30%. What you would do is focus on the area that is close to the ocean. And you can do this in two ways. And I think one of what Cal-Am has basically been arguing is that the only way to do that is through an extraction barrier. And my comment is that is one way. But the other way is to add water to the area near the coast, or to reduce extraction in very specific areas. And that from a technical standpoint, that is the likely scenario. And what that would result in is basically a gradient, which is either flat or significantly reduced within the project, within the model domain. And that is what Weiss basically looked at, is that because the extent of the seawater intrusion extent is pretty much at the edge of the model, the North Marina groundwater model domain, that if you wanted to stop that seawater intrusion without the help of an extraction barrier or an injection barrier, it is very realistic to assume that projects or management actions would be implemented to make that gradient at that location much less steep and raise water levels at the ocean. And I think it's very easy to simulate that scenario. And you don't have to know how much pumping that relates to, because it might actually not be that much. It just may be in a very specific area. And that from a technical standpoint, that's the way that you would do this.
Okay, so I understand that. I'll just say, I mean, Weiss did what Weiss did because of what they had at the time and what their assignments were. So I'm not criticizing Weiss. And frankly, all they had at that time was the 2016 superposition model. But we now have 2022 North Marina groundwater model. So I'll start with you, since you raised this question, and then I'll turn to either Mr. Durbin or Dr. Ye to follow up. I'll just say, it seems to me to be artificial to just tweak North Marina groundwater model boundary conditions to artificially induce a gradient. I would be much more comfortable. This sounds like it's mainly in the Salinas Valley groundwater model, Salinas Valley Basin groundwater model, to make some other changes, either in well pumping or additional recharge. And I totally understand what you're saying. You wouldn't, Sigma implementation probably wouldn't have 50% pumping reduction in San Ardo in the upper basin, because it wouldn't have much benefit and it would have a huge impact. So the focus in the lower area makes a lot of sense. But tell me whether you think, or what you think are the trade-offs between what I'm going to say is artificially inducing a gradient into the North Marina model by adjusting the boundary conditions versus trying to make some assumptions about what really would happen with Sigma implementation in the Salinas Valley groundwater model. What do you think are the trade-offs of doing one versus the other?
I think because of the uncertainty, that the only thing, in my opinion, that you can rely on with regard to Sigma is the undesirable result, which is established at not letting seawater intrusion move further inland. And I can categorically state that in the absence of a seawater intrusion barrier, or be it injection or extraction, the only way to do that is to raise the gradient and basically flatten the gradient and raise the water levels at the ocean. And how someone goes about doing that, there are many different ways. And it's likely to be some combination of recharge, some combination of pumping, and it is impossible to know what that is. And therefore, in my opinion, the only way that you can accurately assess what the potential impacts are of Sigma is to go to the basis of the requirement, which is to stop seawater intrusion. And if the parties want to model an extraction barrier and say, well, that's one other option, and this is the other one, fine. But let's be honest about, these are the only two ways to stop the seawater intrusion, which is mandated under Sigma.
Okay. Well, and I'm not hearing anybody, at least I have not received any testimony indicating that the extraction barrier approach is likely to actually occur. I haven't seen that. Maybe we'll get that. But I'm going to come to you in a minute, Mr. Osias. But first, I want to go to you, Mr. Durbin.
Yes.
In response to my question,
Yes.
what do you think? I mean, you understand. I think you understand the dilemma. Is it more appropriate to just modify the boundary conditions of the North Marina groundwater model to basically induce a certain change in gradient? I assume by gradient we mean mainly on the 180-foot aquifer. Or is it better to try to make assumptions in the Salinas Valley groundwater model about Sigma implementation and then see how that carries forward to the boundary conditions that it would input into the North Marina groundwater model? What's your opinion about that?
It's definitely the latter. On the first option you mentioned, you would not know what management action that corresponded to. So you wouldn't be able, in simply changing the elevations of the boundaries, you wouldn't be able to back out, and at least I don't think very effectively, what it was that might have caused that, and whether that's a plausible, that whatever it is plausible.
Okay. Okay, I think Mr. Osias, and believe me, I appreciate this robust technical discussion. I understand what both of you are saying. It's kind of hard for me to evaluate it right now, but go ahead, Mr. Osias, did you want to comment on this specific issue? I want to try to.
Yes,
Come
it
closer on
it
this
is on this
before.
issue, and I'll just note and won't articulate that there are places where we disagree with Ms. Nelson, but
No, I just heard from Mr. Durbin. He disagreed, and I'm assuming you're
Yeah.
going to stick with Durbin and not with Ms. Nelson. And Mr.
Yeah.
Bouchard has already said, and Mr. Wilkins, that they prefer Ms. Nelson's approach. So that's not surprising. But anyway, go ahead.
okay, so I was going to confirm what we can do, because I think at the end of the day, you will decide if it's helpful.
Right.
So we believe we can, within the time that we included in my email, which was a January 16th submittal date. We think we can do the regional model at 10% and 20% if you wish. I think in connection with that model, we can also do, although I'll ask Mr. Durbin to tell me whether it'll take extra time or not. We could do what, we've all learned about in these proceedings, which is the particle tracking. So he could put a particle on the edge of the seawater intrusion front as mapped by the agency and show you what happens to it at 10, 20, and 30%, or 0 or 50% for that matter, since those are also already model runs. If that's helpful, I think, and I'm going to ask them to confirm, we can get that done by January.
Okay. So is the problem that I will say, I think Ms. Nelson made a pretty strong and valid point that across the basin, reductions in agricultural pumping are probably not a realistic assumption for Sigma implementation. Now, I think I understand why you can do that more readily from a modeling point of view, but
So
what? I'll
my
just-
response would be slightly different. It's not impossible. In fact, it's not. I don't want to know the degree of difficulty. It would, if we wanted to overlay a spatial adjustment for where the pumping reduction occurs, it will take Mr. Durbin and then Dr. Ye longer than that January 16th deadline. I asked them about that, maybe being lucky. And I think it would take another month of time to try to add some spatial component to it.
Okay, well, that's a concern. And
That's why my point here is to tell you what is doable within certain timeframes and ask you if that's what you would like to have done.
well, and frankly, I'm not hearing that if you put a 10% or 20% reduction in I'll say the Upper Valley ag pumping, it may not be realistic, but it doesn't sound like it's going to have any significant effect on the modeled impacts of the Calium slant well pumping associated with Sigma implementation. It might not be realistic, but maybe it's not significant. So Mr. Durbin, I'm going to circle back to you. You've heard this discussion. As I say, I don't like the Weiss approach because I think, you just said it. It sort of assumes this magical Sigma implementation without getting into any details of whether it's realistic or not. But I'm also hearing from Mr. Osias, or speaking for you, I think, that doing anything else would be more challenging. So do you have any comments or thoughts on what makes sense here for Sigma implementation, to model Sigma implementation here?
First of all, I want to clarify that in all the scenarios, the pumping reductions are limited to the pressure in east side areas. So it's I did not make valley-wide changes in the pumping. Mr. Sias and I had a conversation on doability of various works, and during the discussions I said I would need this additional time, but now it just occurred to me that something I could do within the time frame, and that is to make all of the changes in pumping in the pressure area and none in the east side area. So that's something within the January 16th that I could do. Anything other than that would take some reconstructing data sets for the model.
Okay. And I don't know whether this is you, this might be Mr. Loeffler or perhaps Dr. Ye, but I threw out 10 and 20% with no basis whatsoever, but simply for discussion purposes. But does any of the three of you have any idea on what are reasonable brackets? And I'm going to go with what you just said, Mr. Durbin. What are reasonable brackets for percentage reductions in ag well pumping in the pressure area to basically simulate potential Sigma implementation? Is that something that with some brief calculation review of the GSPs, you could come up with a bracket of estimates in those percentage reductions? I don't know, does any of Mr. Durbin, I'll start with you, and if you want to lateral that to Mr. Loeffler or Dr. Ye, go ahead.
I'll at least start this off. There are the GSP focuses on what's happening at the beach at Highway 1. And to have effects there are probably would require a lot of water coming from someplace. But if you change what you're trying to manage to the current seawater intrusion front, that, and you're trying to stop that from moving any further than it is now, then there may be some much lower than 50% levels of pumping reduction that would accomplish that. And I stress the may, because you probably don't like to hear this until I do the model, and I wouldn't know.
Of course. Okay, but so it sounds like, I forget who, but somebody said that, I think it was Dr. Ye, that the 50% pumping reduction resulted in, I'll just say, close to a 0% gradient. Was that correct, Dr. Ye? Did I get that down right?
I think that's probably Mr. Lefter say that.
It was
Okay.
Mr. Osias who said it this morning.
Yeah, I don't think any
Uh-oh.
experts actually said that. That was the point I was trying to make earlier.
Okay, well, we know lawyers, they're not under oath, we'll just say that, but okay, well, and I don't need the answer to that right now, but considering how,
I think-
I'll get to you in just a minute, Dr. Kincaid, thank you. Considering how, well, first of all, I want a clarification, Mr. Durbin, and I think I know the answer. Is the pressure area the same as the 180, 400-foot aquifer subbasin?
I think it extends further south.
Okay,
It
Okay.
goes down to Gonzales, if you know where that is.
I do.
Yeah,
Okay, where the subbasin is more like around Salinas.
yeah. So it's that's where the boundary between the forebay and the pressure area.
Okay. All right, well, I'm hearing sort of, probably, especially considering what the apparent insensitivity of the model results to these changes, I'm hearing that something like maybe we stick with that 50% reduction as sort of the maximum pumping reduction. I'm going to say in the pressure area, and something smaller. And frankly, now I'm beginning to understand why you use 30%, and maybe that makes sense. Is that sort of an assumption for the minimal amount of Sigma implementation? And again, I understand these are surrogates for what actually could be recharge projects and pumping reductions. But I'd like to get some evidence as to what are reasonable. Number one, is using ag pumping modeling reductions in ag pumping a reasonable surrogate for Sigma implementation? That's very important. And number two, if so, what are reasonable boundaries for the bracketing of that? And maybe those are what we have. Mr. Durbin, go ahead. Something else on that?
Yeah, what I wanted to add is that the impact of the project on the hydraulics of the groundwater system are independent of the what might happen with Sigma. So the differential effects of the project on hydraulic considerations, and those will be groundwater level drawdowns or the change in flow from the ocean into the groundwater system. The only thing that is dependent on gradients near the coast has to do with the ocean water percentage. So that is dependent upon transport processes within the groundwater system, which depends upon overall gradient, the actual gradients, complete gradients, not just the differential gradients. So depending on where you're, if we treat those two things differently, what I'm saying is for the hydraulic stuff, and you can see that in I think in some of the testimony that is heard, there isn't much effect on the project impacts. For the ocean water percentage, a different story. And so it depends on what's important to you and what you might want us to focus on.
Okay, well, ocean water percentages and also lateral extent of capture zones.
Say that again.
The lateral extent of the inland lateral extent of the capture zones is significantly dependent on the difference in gradient, in overall gradient.
Yes, but the total amount of new induced ocean water that comes into the system is independent. So if you look at the answer to your question first is yes. But if you look at the entire contact between the groundwater system from north to south, it's independent.
Okay, well, that is helpful, and I appreciate that. I'm not sure what is most important to the court. I will say, I think the hydraulics and the seawater intrusion and ultimately potential impacts on the water quality salinity at Marina Coast Water District wells are the most important, should be the most important thing. But you know, we do have a list of different questions from the court, but obviously that's the one that has real impacts and potentially is most significant. So I'm going to go to Mr. Leffler while we're on the Cal-Am witnesses, and then we can shift over to, I think Dr. Kincaid has his hand up. So Mr. Leffler, good afternoon. Do you have an additional comment to make here?
Good afternoon. And before I make my statement, I just want to note that I've been having an unstable internet connection at times here. So if I don't come through clearly, let me know. I may have to call in.
Okay, you're clear for now, so go ahead.
Okay, I think this is clear, but I want to make sure that everyone understands that when we did these pumping reduction scenarios, we were looking at what was happening at the ocean shoreline interface in terms of net inflows and outflows, and trying to, get close to, a zero net inflow outflow, which, is on the order of a 50% reduction. Now, whether that translates directly to that will stop movement of the seawater intrusion front, or it takes some other pumping reduction to do that, let's say potentially is somewhat less than 50%. We did not directly evaluate that. And I think it's been discussed that could be evaluated with perhaps some particle tracking to confirm whether that number is really 50% reduction or some other amount of reduction. So I think that's clear, but I wasn't entirely sure.
Okay, well, that is important because we're not sure, I'm not sure whether Sigma implementation is looking at stopping the seawater intrusion or at the ocean interface, as you said, or stopping continued inward migration of the seawater intrusion front. I don't know, Mr. Leffler, do you have a comment on that?
Yes, I do.
You're sure you know more about Sigma implementation than I do.
So my understanding of Sigma is it is at the seawater intrusion front, that the zone of seawater intrusion is not to expand. And I believe that my recollection is the 180-400 subbasin GSP has set that at the 2017 year line that has been defined by the water agency.
Okay.
And so that is I believe that's the minimum threshold that they want to not exceed that.
Okay. So let's go over, Dr. Kincaid, you had something to say, and then I have a question for you as well. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. And it's caveat this, which is it's not my intention to speak at all about Sigma or the implementation, but from my perspective, the key factor that we saw affect the size of the capture zone and OWP is the overall gradient across the model. And so my thought is that these discussions like we've just had are very relevant. And I agree completely with you and Mr. Durbin about like being able to tie a particular gradient to a management action and that or strategy and that obvious problems associated with that. But that said, it seems to me that if the focus could be on agreeing to a gradient, that's something that would be more tractable and more easily evaluated in the modeling and therefore its effect on the capture zone and OWP. So it's more of a pragmatic type of thing, suggestion or comment rather than a comment on the actual things that you guys have been discussing.
So Dr. Kincaid, while we're on you, this is something I was thinking and following up on Mr. Brochard's comments and Ms. Nelson's comments. If CalAmp's technical experts rerun, and frankly, I guess I'll say one of the problems I had is I don't think this explanation I'm receiving today on why they did the 30% and 50% groundwater reduction scenarios was documented. I think they just said they did them. So that's why, and it may be buried in the memo and I just haven't seen it, but I don't remember seeing that. But if they provide documentation on that, and basically support, this is a reasonable bracket for Sigma implementation, and we think the groundwater, the agricultural well pumping reductions in the pressure zone is a reasonable surrogate for modeling all Sigma implementation actions. That gives, and of course, as I said earlier, the fact that the project impacts don't seem to be particularly sensitive to this either. That gives me a fair amount of comfort that we have a way to go forward. So my question then for you is, if they did that, and we're going to talk about, clearly they've proposed some changes to their modeling work, but if they did that and provided you the model output files, and of course for both models, but could you then run on your own the North Marina groundwater model with the adjustments and boundary conditions that Ms. Nelson and Mr. Brochard have talked about to change the gradient if necessary, even with the 50% pumping reduction scenario? Is that something you then could do with their modeling?
Yes, we could do that.
Okay, so what I'm thinking is the best way to address this, I mean, clearly there's a disagreement here, and I'm not in a position to resolve it. I have stated my concerns with the adjustment and boundary conditions to affect gradient, that I think that's it's sort of forcing a result that may or may not be realistic. But I certainly understand Marina Coast Water District's witnesses' points and reasons why they want to do that. And so that may then, I don't want to have more different brackets than we need to, because this can really get out of hand fast. But that may be an additional bracketing, and then I can put that in our report, and of course the State Water Board and the court can evaluate that. This is something that it's something that people like me can understand with some explanation as to why here are the different assumptions and here are the different results. And it sounds like primarily that if the gradient needs to be further adjusted, that's going to change the size of the capture zone and the ocean water percentage. So anyway, that sort of is where I think I'm headed now. But Ms. Nelson, you were next. Well, lots of hands up, but let's go with you, Ms. Nelson. Please go ahead.
I think that the idea of trying to calculate something that says that this management action would result in no further expansion of the seawater intrusion front I would concur with that type of an opinion. I think what we would want to do is really be able to look at what's been modeled by Mr. Durbin and verify that that is a true statement. And I guess I would like to just put out there that as long as there's ocean water coming in, it is hard for me to imagine that the seawater intrusion front won't ultimately move because of the density issues, which will not be addressed by this model. But I am open to the idea of Mr. Durbin pontificating on that. And if he feels that he can create a model and defend it and say that with this type of reduction in pumping, it will stop the seawater intrusion front, and he can say that with confidence, then I I do not see necessarily an issue with your approach.
Okay, and thank you. And that is very helpful. I appreciate that. I just want to be clear, when you say front, I don't, that's what I understood Mr. Durbin to say was the number of, or the amount of modeled seawater intrusion going across the sea land boundary. I look at front as the saline water front further inland and whether that migrates inland or outward.
Well, that's actually what Sigma requires. The 180-400 foot subbasin does say that as Mr. Leffler pointed out, the minimum threshold in the 180-400 foot aquifer GSP says that the 500 milligram per liter chloride line cannot move further inland.
Okay, because Mr. Durbin, did I hear you wrong? I didn't hear that you said that your modeling would address the front. I thought you said it would address the amount of seawater, basically, I'm going to say passing the ocean land interface. Did I hear that wrong, or is that correct?
Yeah, I think there was some confusion. No, it can address the ocean waterfront or the seawater intrusion front, I should say, the inland front.
Okay, so the inland migration, what I'm going to call the saltwater or the saline water front, because at that point it's a mixture of ocean water. But you're saying that can be part of your analysis.
Now, just a little reply to Ms. Nelson. I can run a scenario that somebody tells me to run. I don't feel competent to, or well, no, I would feel competent, but I definitely do not have the time to do a GSP, a new GSP evaluation for a particular project that they might implement. And so I don't think there's any convincing other that what I ran will or will not stop it. All I can say is this is what the model shows, and I'm not arguing anything regarding the implementation or the plausibility of various GSP implementation plans.
Okay, but if you say you think you can determine at this reduction in ag well pumping in the pressure zone, it will stop the inland migration of the saline water front. You did say you think you can do that. Is that correct?
What I would do would be to, well, first of all, examine the runs that we've already done with the 50, well, I can't remember what all the percentages are, up to 100%, and look at whether what that says about the seawater intrusion front.
Okay.
And if it looks like less pumping reduction could stop the front from moving, then we could run alternatives that had less than 30%.
Okay, so I have to say, you have to explain this to me. How can your model, your Salinas Valley Basin groundwater model, how does it model the saline intrusion front? Because I didn't think it had water quality as a parameter in the modeling, does it?
It does not, and it would all be through just looking at what is called the effective part of transport, and that's where dissolved solids move with the water molecules, and it ignores the potential effects of dispersion, and if density is an important factor, it ignores that. But through the particle tracking, I can, with this understanding, provide information on what the model says about what would happen to the front?
Okay. I learn a lot every time we have one of these meetings. So Mr. Leffler, go ahead. While we're on Cal-Am's witnesses, go ahead.
Yes, thanks. So I just wanted to make a comment on the likelihood of, say a range of pumping reductions reflecting the potential range of essentially projects and management actions. I'm a member of what's called the SWIG and the SWIG TAC, which came out of the GSP for the 180-400 subbasin, where the various projects have been discussed. And an extraction barrier is very much on the table right now. And in fact, my understanding is that the model that's currently being constructed, that has been referred to at times in this testimony, that would have a density component to it. One of the things that is intended to do is evaluate an extraction barrier and what it would do and how it would work and what its effects would be. So I think that, an extraction barrier, at this point in time, at least for my understanding, is as much on the table for implementation in the 180-400 subbasin as are other potential actions. So I guess I wanted to flag that as something that really is very much still on the table.
Okay, well, I don't think I've heard any evidence on that before, so I appreciate that clarification. But it raises some concerns for me, because I assume to model, and I'd have to shift back to Mr. Durbin, but I would suspect there'd be some significant changes in the Salinas Valley groundwater model that would be necessary to model implementation of an extraction barrier. Maybe I'll just ask Mr. Durbin, is that correct?
No, I would just need the specification of, what they're considering. I will repeat again that the extraction barrier would not have an effect on the differential hydraulic impact of the project on the groundwater basin. It would have an impact on the ocean water percentage, and my guess is that it would probably go up because the extraction barrier would be pulling in even more saline ocean water into the groundwater system.
So would it also affect the areas of the capture zones?
Well, yes, I think the extraction barrier would create a steeper gradient between the barrier and the shore, and correspondingly reduce the size of the capture zone.
Okay. Okay, it's going to be a more inland gradient in that area. Got it.
Yeah.
All right. So Mr. Osias, and then I'll go back to you, Ms. Nelson. Go ahead, Mr. Osias.
Thank you. So I had 2 points I wanted to make. The first, I think, was just made a little bit by Mr. Leffler. When you commented in this workshop setting that you thought the only viable action was pumping reduction, I wanted to correct that.
Well, I said and recharge.
Yes, I apologize. It's a bad paraphrase. So first, if you'll recall, that GSP has a project that is under study, which is the seawater intrusion barrier that Mr. Leffler just commented on, so I won't say any further.
Okay.
Second, it included and rejected for further study even a injection barrier. So that's
Okay.
not on the table. And then, of course, there is a reduction for various reasons to extractions. Not all ag reductions. So
Okay,
that was
well-
one point I wanted to make.
Okay. And
The second is,
I heard from
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I heard from Ms. Nelson, both reductions and extractions and potential increases in recharge, either in lieu recharge or direct physical recharge. But anyway, go ahead.
Okay. I mean, the GSP's in, and we went to that page, so that's all I can say on the injection barrier.
Oh, no, I get that. I think
okay.
Ms. Nelson clearly testified that the injection barrier is not being considered. I assume primarily because there's no good water supply for it. But anyway,
Correct.
Anything else you want to say, Mr.?
Yes, on the, I'm not, and I'm going to pose this as a comment, but I want my experts for Cal-Am to correct me if I've got it wrong. I do not believe they used 30% and 50% as a bracket of their opinion of the reasonable alternatives of Sigma. I think the 50% was to cause zero seawater intrusion to cross the ocean land interface. And I think I do believe they commented on the impracticality of that as a basic assumption. And 30% was a sort of a sensitivity run to see what the effect was with less. That was a material amount less. And not that Sigma would produce something between those two. And you've said that now a couple of times as the bracket, and I don't think that's what they're saying or believe, but they'll correct me if I paraphrase it wrong.
No, I did not hear them to say that was as a surrogate for Sigma implementation. But I don't know, Mr. Leffler, do you want to just clarify that one point? I mean,
Yes.
I did say the problem was there didn't seem to be any documentation for why they did it. That was my problem. Go ahead, Mr. Leffler.
Yeah.
On that one point.
Yeah, I think you may be right about that, but I think I can shed light on the 30%. I think the 50% has been described as that's, how we ended up on that number. The 30%, I believe, was to simulate something that had been simulated previously by Mr. Yates of USGS in 1988 in his report, which I believe is, in the records for for this hearing, where he went through a similar exercise and reduced pumping to see what the effect was on seawater intrusion. He only went up to a 30% reduction and concluded that that still wasn't enough to, cause zero seawater intrusion. And we sort of use that as a benchmark to say, okay, this is what a previous study used and concluded about 30%. What happens when we do 30%? And I think we got a similar answer as to what Mr. Yates had reported in his previous work.
Okay, and I think there may even be a cite to that. I know the Yates report is in the evidence, so thank you. So Ms. Nelson, what are your comments now?
Yeah, I think that, there's clearly many different ways to get to sustainability. The first thing I wanted to make sure that you understood that when I said in lieu recharge, I don't mean an injection barrier. I mean taking water off the river, for example, which is one of the projects that's included within the GSP. So I do
understand the difference between in lieu recharge and the injection barrier. So thank you.
And I wanted to say that, there are many projects here, and, in my opinion, it is likely to be some combination of all of these, which is what gets so difficult. But if it's your intent to say, well, what's one option, and that is using, management actions to address this, which, to be quite honest, if it goes to a court, probably will be the answer because it'll be an adjudication. I don't think that's an unreasonable assessment.
Okay.
And hypothesizing on which other project, whether it's in lieu or a extraction barrier, starts getting really complicated.
I agree. And that's why I referred to the ag pumping reductions as a surrogate for the other projects. You're right. None of us know how this is going to play out.
I do think that Mr. Durbin should address in his discussion the potential impacts of density on his analysis.
Mhm.
And I think I heard him to talk about potentially addressing that, but I'm not sure. I don't know, Mr. Durbin, do you want to say anything about that?
Yes, and I will be looking at that issue and the importance of that, or potential importance of that. And I think that Dr. Ye also is going to do some examination of that.
Okay, we really got sidetracked primarily because of me on this question of Sigma implementation, which I don't think is probably the big, well, I don't know, but the reason I say I don't think it's the biggest issue is it doesn't seem to have, at least based on the Dr. Kincaid's spreadsheet, doesn't seem to have huge impacts or huge effects on the modeled impacts of the project, the differences in scenarios. I mean, I heard Dr. Kincaid say the baseline numbers in the scenarios are somewhat different, but the differences due to project effects are not that different. Mr. Wilkins, do you have something else on this? I really want to move on from Sigma implementation.
That I do want to, before we move on from Sigma implementation, and we certainly can address this later, I think it's in Mr. Brochard's notes. Want to note that there's more than just the Salinas Valley GSP at issue here. We have the Monterey Subbasin GSP at issue, and how this project affects Marina Coast's ability to actually implement its GSP. And I just want to, if you're moving on from the SGMA, I at least want to make sure that you understand Mr. Brochard's point on that, and if necessary, to have Ms. Nelson explain a little bit further what we propose needs to be done for that issue.
Okay. Okay, who wants to talk? Ms. Nelson, do you want to say something, or Mr. Brochard? I was talking Sigma implementation, which obviously includes Monterey Subbasin GSP implementation. Is there something further regarding that issue that you think we should talk about? Go ahead, Ms. Nelson.
Yes, I think one of the things that we would like to understand, I think there's a huge amount of back and forth as to whether or not, if you drop water levels, by half a foot along the Monterey Subbasin boundary, or by a foot or 0.2 feet. That's one of your questions. And
those were numbers I sort of just threw out there because I'd sort of seen them. But
it's the range of what the model results are saying to date, right? I mean,
okay.
We'll see what new model results say, but we would like to comment that in our opinion, those declines are very significant for potential for additional seawater intrusion. And we can debate that back and forth, but I think one of the things that the court should assess is how much we would have to cut back in extraction to get that half a foot back along the boundary.
Okay. I think that's addressed in some of my other issues, but that's we can talk about, or we have talked. It's worth noting it here, but I think we will come back to address that. So let me, because I think that comes up in effects. Well, anyway, I do think that's down the road, but let me go back to big picture here. There are quite a few other, I mean, I'm looking at Mr. Osias's comments here. There are quite a few other, I'll say, model parameters that are discussed here that apparently CalAM's expert witnesses are proposing to adjust, basically in response to the comments from MCWD and City of Marina's expert witnesses, and to do new model runs and to complete those by January 16th. So I'm going to first go back to you, Mr. Osias, and then we'll shift around as necessary among everybody else. This has been a good discussion, which I appreciate. Is there anything you want to say about these other parameters?
I think they capture, that was a bad pun. I didn't mean that. They include the what's in your questions that you emailed, but also include questions that you or others had during the sessions we just finished. Not all of these are going to take very long, and I'll give, but I think we should address them all. And I think, for example, Ms. Nelson's last comment about heads and barriers is captured in this list. And seawater intrusion outside the capture zone is clearly on this list. That's number 2. And so I do think we have specific activities to undertake with respect to each of these that would be helpful to your stated goal of evolving into a better state of knowledge. And even if we don't have agreement on both sides, perhaps the area or extent of disagreement narrows.
That would be my goal.
Yeah, and
That
so
is my goal.
I think these are the right topics and categories. I mean, I shouldn't even say a couple. Let me use one as an example that I'm actually able to articulate, I think, subject to correction from all the experts probably. But the hydraulic conductivity is a combination of K and thickness. And so adjusting both isn't necessary. If you adjust the K, to a degree that someone agrees with it, you don't need to adjust the thickness. They produce the same, when combined, outcome. And that the thickness should be a reflection of the I don't know how to say that word, but the stratigraphic profile, whereas the K is much more subject to disagreement at the moment between the parties. And
But Ms. Nelson had alluded to pump tests that had been done.
Yes. I'm just saying that the formula for conductivity involves K times T, I think, if I have the right value. But that's something that I think we're willing to look at both. I just wanted to make that observation for you because I heard that today too from my people.
Okay. And, I'll just say intuitively, from my point of view, the MCWD and City of Marina witnesses put on the maps, which showed the modeled K values in different parts of it. I'm going to say the dune sand aquifer. I'm not sure whether that was layer 2 or layer 4, which both are parts of the dune sand aquifer. But that did cause me some concern. It just seemed intuitively like that was not really close to the actual physical conditions there. So I'm hoping that can be addressed. I mean, their argument was that those should be more uniform across each entire model layer. But I don't know if you
So
want.
I'll have Dr. Ye or Mr. Durbin or Mr. Leffler confirm, but I think they are proposing to change K level or K, whatever that is.
We can call it K values, I think.
K value, run new scenarios with different K values, both for purposes of sensitivity, how much does it matter? And I think they intend to address the relationship to the real world. But
also
both, not just one.
Okay, and presumably that does spill over into talking about calibration, I would think. Okay, so why don't you keep going, and then we'll see. I see other hands.
Well, so you started this morning, or this afternoon, which seems like a long time ago, with did I have any comments I wanted to make about this? And I guess my overarching comment is, I think this is a list that's both doable and helpful and not overly ambitious and touches on the things that you have identified, as well as some that have come up through the proceedings. So I think they're all appropriate. I will point out that there was a whole series of questions, I think by you, that we're proposing to do in part under number 3 on the list, our list, which was, can you quantify analytically also the answers to some questions? You asked some volume questions, for example, and other quantifiable things. So they intend to do that, as well as the model adjustments, and again within that same time window. So my comment is encourage us to go forward with that.
Well, and yeah, down under 3C, and you probably wrote this sort of in response to one of my questions.
No, we developed the draft of this before we received your questions, but after we had the little conversation, at the hearing.
Okay. And I mean, I'll just say right now, what I've heard from the hearing is the model estimates that the project impacts would cause some additional drawdown in the vicinity of MCWD wells. I mean, the particular wells of concern are 29, 30, and 31, because those have screenings in the 180-foot aquifer. And those drawdowns were the order of 0.5 feet, I think. And I have no way of knowing whether or not that's significant. I think, to paraphrase roughly, Mr. Leffler said he didn't think it was significant, where Ms. Nelson said she thought it was very significant. But short of doing a variable density model, as I understand it, there are some analytical calculations that could be done looking at the hydraulic conductivity in the relevant reaches and the gradients between there and the seawater intrusion front to determine flow. I mean, I think that, if I'm not mistaken, I think that's Darcy's law. But I think there are some things like that that could be done. But I would like something, rather than just somebody saying, "Oh, that's not significant," and somebody else saying that's very significant. Obviously, we like to work on results of quantitative analysis. So
with your permission, I'd like Mr. Leffler to confirm that he can do that kind of quantification that you just described.
Let's go to Mr. Leffler, and then also Mr. Osias's 3A talks about the need for a variable density model, and if you can comment on that as well. So go ahead, Mr. Leffler, if you can provide some insight, not results, obviously, but just what can be done here.
Yes, I can comment on that. I just wanted to I thought Mr. Osias gave a good overview. Just one very quick technical correction. It's what the model actually uses is transmissivity, which is the hydraulic conductivity, or K, times the model thickness, model layer thickness. So those two components combine to give the transmissivity, which is what the model actually uses. So I just kind of wanted to make that clarification there. On the density, I think we would definitely address that issue. We would take a couple different approaches, which Mr. Ye and Mr. Durbin would actually be doing this work, but we do some analytical based calculations that Mr. Durbin would do to evaluate that issue. And then we would look at the variable density model that we already have, which is the CMEX model, and we would utilize that to shed some more light on this issue. And that would be part of what we would provide in January.
So I'm trying really hard to keep up with all of this, but is there any evidence in the record about the CMEX modeling results?
The CMEX model is described in the HWG TM number 2, which may in and of itself be in the record, but it certainly is in the record as an appendix to the HWG 2017 technical report that summarizes the large amount of work that had been done up to that time.
Okay, but my question is, are there any evidence or any reports or memoranda that that are in our record that discuss the results of CMEX modeling, or this, which I understand is a variable density model, on this question of how changes in hydraulic head at MCWD wells could affect or induce additional changes in salinity? I'll just leave it at that. I don't recall anything like that in the record. That's why I'm asking.
I don't recall if it's, I think this is something that came up on the SIR rebuttal more as something that our updated modeling doesn't account for. So I think, this is in response, this is one of the items in response to the SIR rebuttal. But Mr. Ye may have something more to offer on that as well.
Dr. Ye, anything else? And that's okay. I want to make sure I haven't missed it, but it seems like it's pretty important. Go ahead, Dr. Ye.
Yes, CMEX model was described in Geoscience 2015 report.
Okay, but
So-
my question is whether there are any model results related to the impacts of the slant well project.
Well, that model was used to simulate the ocean water percentage for the project. And the CMEX model is 2 miles by 2 miles domain. So that model will not be able to simulate impact to MCWD wells, but will provide useful information, to show the effects without variable density.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. I didn't, okay, so, but that, we'll just leave it at that. You understand the concern. It's
Yes.
MCWD has raised this concern, and frankly, it's one of the most important concerns in this whole proceeding, which
Yes.
is how do these changes in head potentially affect the inward, I'll just say the inland migration of the saline water front. So to the extent that can be addressed in this additional work, that would be very useful. So, okay, so thank you, Dr. Ye. I think that clarifies that. I'll go through my staff's notes in just a minute, but let me go to Dr. Kincaid, and at some point we can take a break and regroup here. Go ahead, Dr. Kincaid.
Thank you, sir. If you allow me, I have two comments about, we've talked about two things now. The first is going back to the question about hydraulic conductivity and thickness. And as Mr. Leffler pointed out, there's two different things, both components of the calculation of transmissivity. But more importantly, the reason I raised that is that we believe that, and I believe as Dr. Ye has talked about, that the hydraulic conductivities were particularly the ones we're most concerned about, the low hydraulic conductivities along the east side of the project area, were defined in order to facilitate calibration. And the reason we discussed the thickness of layer 3 is really perhaps we used a not clear vernacular, but I believe that the elevation of layer 3, and particularly the drop in elevation as it drops down towards the coast, could have a significant impact on calibration. So changing it from its more uniform condition that it is now to reflect that geometry or thickness change as you go from west to east could be a significant component or a significant influence on calibration. So not therefore having to rely as heavily on hydraulic conductivities. So that's why we made that included that comment. And then second is
Can I just stop you?
Of course.
Dr. Ye, do you agree that it may be appropriate to change I'll say the model geometry of layer 3 to address this drop in elevation toward the coast?
Yeah, I can take a look at more detail, but in general, I disagree with that. Because the reason we use lower K is really we need a lower transmissivity in that area in order to match observed water level. You can see east and the west of that lower K zone, the hydraulic gradient are significantly different. West of that low K zone, it's very flat. That's you can see the head change between NW1 and NW7, just a few feet. So we need a lower transmissivity. But if right now I increase the K, in order to calibrate that model, we need to lower the thickness. Increase K, then I need to lower the thickness. So then that's just, not consistent with the geological cross section, delineated in that area. So that's my initial thoughts, but certainly we can take a look at that.
Okay, and there's nothing stopping you all, assuming your attorneys will let you, there's nothing stopping you all from talking with each other about this. And I really encourage that. I mean, I suspect, Dr. Ye, if you and Dr. Kincaid discuss this, and I really encourage you to do this offline. If your attorneys need to be involved, fine. If not, better, probably. But if you can discuss this and perhaps reach some consensus, that would be very valuable from my point of view for this proceeding. So I just want to throw that out there. I've worked with technical experts for many years, and a lot of times if the different parties' technical experts can talk with one another, they can work a lot of things out. So anyway, please consider that as appropriate. And Dr. Kincaid, go ahead, your hand is up.
Yes. So the second thing.
Oh, yes, your second point, go ahead.
That I wanted to make was about the concern about drawdown relative to MCWD's wells. And I just wanted to make a clarification, or to be clear about our concern, which is its effect on what has been described as the protective head that is currently allowing there to be fresh water in portions of the 180-foot aquifer that are not reflected in the more simplistic delineation or depiction of saline water impacts that have been published. So in other words, we know there's fresh water there as a result of the AEM data, and quite frankly, of the fact that they're pumping fresh water at those particular wells. And those protective heads are really located closer to the coast. So essentially, if we look at the available data, we see that there's higher heads closer to the coast in the 180-foot aquifer that are preventing saltwater from moving into what we presume to be MCWD's capture zones, and therefore a drawdown in those areas, not necessarily right at the MCWD wells, is the issue of concern. And I know that Ms. Nelson can explain that situation, and I know that I've seen she had showed some of that in her testimony, but she can explain that better than I can. But that is, I just want to throw that as a clarification. Our concern isn't that 0.5 or 0.2 feet of drawdown at MCWD's wells themselves, but it is in a drop in what would be the protective head that currently allows there to be fresh water to be extracted there.
Okay, well, thank you. That is an important clarification. That I know Ms. Nelson testified in detail about those protective heads, so I do appreciate that that clarification. Okay, so let me regroup here and figure out where we are right now. I do have some comments from my technical people. I think we've covered some of them, maybe not all of them, which I think at this point, and they texted me some comments as we were talking here today. So I think I'll take a break and go over that. And I do want to look, well, before we get to the break, Mr. Brochard, since I didn't carefully review the email you sent before on time, it was my mistake, but I have looked at it now. Is there anything you want to add following? I mean, we certainly have your email and we'll read it carefully, but is there anything you want to add right now following up or related to your email?
No, I don't think so. I do think that the Marina Coast, and I'm sure the city would like the opportunity to have their experts make adjustments to the model also. I think Mr. Osias's prediction that it can be done in a month is a little more optimistic than what we thought. We're not sure that the differences can be made. I think it's a good idea to possibly maybe have the experts get together and try and discuss some issues, because some of the stuff I had listed involved layer construction as well. Just the whole idea of splitting the dune sand aquifer into two separate layers. I'm not sure that that's justified by all the evidence we've seen. But I think the experts could have that discussion.
Yeah, well, as I understand it, the real problem is that there's no hydro. I understand why they want layers 2 and 4, because the Salinas Valley Aquitard is layer 3. But as I understand it, the problem is that then there's no hydraulic separation between layers 4 and 5. Is that the problem, or am I missing something here?
I think it's better to have Ms. Nelson discuss it. I think
that's a good response for a lawyer to make.
I have heard discussions of different aquifers underneath the Aquitard, but it's normally in the people talking about the upper and lower 180-foot aquifer, not an upper and lower dune sand aquifer. And I understand their consideration issues as to whether the DSA is perched or not, and how that's going to be reflected. And like I said, I think the experts can discuss those issues and how they have a change or an effect on the modeling results or not.
Okay.
There was one other issue that I had in my thing, but
go ahead, and then we'll come back. You caused Mr. Leffler to raise his hand, so go ahead.
Yeah, that's why I was pausing.
Go ahead.
I think people have discussed the gradients. We also noted that there are equivalent freshwater heads in the ocean that we think need to be addressed. Again, I think that's something the experts can do. And we noticed in looking at the model, I think yesterday, that one of the settings we think needs to be changed. It's set so that when certain cells dry out, they can't become wet again. And we're not sure that that's been discussed or addressed. And I think that should be adjusted for further models.
Well, that's certainly a technical question. That's going to be beyond the lawyer's expertise pretty quickly, at least mine. So Mr. Leffler, did you want to comment at this point? Your hand was up and it went down, but go ahead.
Well, yeah, could be addressed later, but I just wanted to maybe make a comment that I don't think we or anyone is saying there's an aquitard between layers 4 and 5 beneath FOSVA.
Right. None of the figures show that. Anyway, go ahead.
Right. Yeah. So I just wanted to confirm that.
I guess the question, though,
clarify that.
As I understand it, the question is, so do you need to model those 2 layers separately if there's no aquitard between them?
Well, I think I don't know that it has any real effect. I mean, in essence, those layers beneath the aquitard just sort of operate as, as one unit. And I mean, it's not unusual to divide, to have an aquifer that maybe without any aquitard within it, you have multiple layers to just get better vertical discretization. But I think overall, I guess my main comment is that I think splitting it the way we've done in this current version is a significant improvement over representing it as one unit, as had been done before. So I'm a little confused why there's some thought that this was not a good idea or isn't a better representation, because clearly it separates out the perched mounted aquifer lying above the FOSVA. Those are very different geologically. And then, you know, whether or not that layer 4 beneath it is considered part of the 180 or is a thin portion of the dune sand aquifer lying right on top of the 180. I don't know that it has any significant ramifications to model results.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it certainly, again, this is lawyer trying to look at groundwater modeling, but it certainly seems to me like the layer 2 for the perch conditions does need to be modeled separately. But Dr. Kincaid, you know a lot more about this than I do. I don't know if you're going to comment on that or something else, but go ahead.
No, I just want to make a brief comment on that. And the concern that we have is more focused on the 180-foot aquifer. Essentially, we see poor calibration in layer 5, or the representation of the 180-foot aquifer. And we see significant evidence that there's fresh water in that portion, or at least in the upper portion of the 180-foot aquifer. So there seems to be strong justification for separating the 180 into a upper and lower layer, and that doing so may help to improve the calibration there and also better represent the conditions that are at most at concern right now, which is the distribution of saltwater and freshwater in the aquifer. And then second, it's just
so I'm clear, the 180 right now is all layer 5.
Yes, sir. It's represented as layer 5.
Okay.
And then the only other thing, I agree with what Mr. Leffler said about numerical separating them, but the vernacular I think should be pretty close. And I believe from my evaluation, the way that layer 4 is articulated now, it carries the properties of the aquitard beneath the Salinas Valley aquitard. And so essentially what we see is a separation of where the 180 and the dune sand aquifer come into hydraulic communication on the west. We see that divided into 3 layers, which I don't necessarily think it has much of, you know, I take no exception with that. It's really the poor calibration in layer 5 and how that could potentially be improved by separating layer 5 into an upper and lower, the 180 into an upper and lower zone, or upper and lower aquifer.
Okay, well, I'll certainly give the Cal-Am witnesses, you don't need to respond now. You want to respond now. I cringe at the thought of adding another model layer. I'm sure it's going to be hard to do that within this month time frame, but go ahead, Mr. Leffler.
Well, I guess maybe I'll defer it to, you know, part of what we'll describe in our January work. But, you know, I think we disagree with some of what Mr. Kincaid said right there. And we believe that, you know, well, we don't agree about the model calibration, characterization, and the need to split that layer. And, you know, I guess we can speak to that further in what we describe in January, rather than have a long discussion now.
Okay, I did wonder for you or Dr. Ye, what is your comment? This is 1B in Mr. Osias's outline. What is your comment about the southern boundary of the North Marina groundwater model and the intrabasin flow, basically between the Salinas Valley groundwater model and the North Marina groundwater model? Do you have a comment on that, either one of you?
Well, I might defer to Mr. Ye or Mr. Durbin to describe the southern boundary item there, and because we believe we've adequately addressed that through a combination of the regional model and the North Marina model, but you know, because the regional model boundary is quite far away from MCWD wells, and so that, you know, simulation is incorporated into the North Marina model boundary condition. And I guess with that introduction, if either Mr. Durbin or Mr. Ye want to comment further.
So, and I'll just state, the problem I heard from MCWD's witnesses and City of Marina is that the southern boundary of the North Marina groundwater model is quite close to the MCWD wells. And at that boundary condition, it's been modeled as a constant head boundary condition. And what they stated is therefore the effects of the Cal-Am slant well pumping may not be properly modeled in that area because basically it's so close to the boundary and there's a constant head boundary. So Mr. Durbin or Dr. Ye, do you have any preliminary responses to that comment?
Yes, yeah. So that description of a constant head is not true. You know, actually, that boundary condition vary by month. It's really that water level assigned to there or based on the model simulate water levels from the regional model on a monthly basis. So this is a standard practice to resolve the model domain issues.
Okay, but then what about the argument that the regional model obviously does not include any simulation of the Cal-Am slant well pumping. So what about the argument?
That's not true.
Oh, the regional model has the
So every time we run the model, we run the regional model first without project.
Okay. I did not realize that. I'm sorry if that's basic. Probably is.
So then the North Marina model take that results from regional models.
Okay, well, that seems pretty important to me. So what I hear you say is that basically then, at least at the regional model level of precision, the Cal-Am slant well pumping is simulated, and that changes the heads at the boundary condition going into the North Marina.
Right. It's really just like the resolution. The regional model probably, doesn't have the very good resolution in the project area, but away from the project area, still provide the good model simulation.
Okay. Well, and I mean, these are exactly the sorts of questions that's why we have hearings. That's why we have these processes, so that we can have this back and forth and hopefully hone in on resolution of these issues. So before I take a break, I'm going to just ask the attorneys whether they have any comments on this idea of these technical experts meeting and going over some of these points. I mean, this is obviously something that's done. And frankly, here it may make a lot of sense. I mean, they can talk to each other in technical terms far better than I'll ever understand, and also not in a formal hearing process, but more just in an informal process. So does anybody have any comments on whether or not that makes sense here? And if so, what is the best timing for that vis-a-vis Cal-Am's additional modeling work? So I'm going to start, since it would be Cal-Am's modeling work that would be critiqued here. I'm going to start with Mr. Osias. Do you have any comments on this, the viability or appropriateness of informal discussions?
And my comment is that something as potentially significant as that activity warrants a conversation between us and the experts so we can hear what they think, and among our legal team. And I'm not saying we need a long time to have that opportunity, but I don't think I'm comfortable commenting on the wisdom of it or opposite on the fly without talking with Mr. Durbin and Mr. Leffler and Dr. Ye at a minimum, and then my colleagues. So I apologize for punting, but
No, that's a perfectly appropriate answer. I don't know, Mr. Bouchard, for MCWD, do you have any comments on that issue, or do you want to, I'll just say punt as well for now.
I mean, I'd be happy to talk it over with our team, but from a practical perspective, I generally don't have a problem with experts talking to each other. Our goal is to, get actual answers here as best as possible. This isn't a game of hide the ball.
Well, I hope not. Mr. Wilkins, go ahead.
Not exactly on that point, but just in terms of your question, I think Mr. Brochard's email outlined that we really believe it's important for us to also do this work. Guys, I don't think we're going to agree on everything. We believe we can do things. We think it's going to take a little bit longer than the middle of January, but not so long we wouldn't be able to complete it within the hearings that you've set forth and asked us to hold. So after the break, I think we'd like to make sure at least we talk about that issue. So in case you hadn't honed in on that in his email, I want to make sure you realize we are proposing to do some of these corrections ourselves to the model and provide you that, assuming we don't agree as some informal process with CalAm that they'll do exactly what we're hoping to do. We want to present that evidence to you, and we think that's important. So just in case you hadn't noticed that, I want to make sure, because you kept saying CalAm is going to do the work, and I want to make sure we are proposing to do some of the work ourselves.
So that's fine, but I guess my question is, it seems like you'd need to see their new modeling work before you could make corrections to it. It doesn't make sense for you to correct the files you've received now when they're going to be changing them anyway, does it?
I don't think we're going to have time to wait for their new model to give you, then correct it. So I think, maybe we could talk about what we propose we would do. And again, maybe there's a chance that we could meet and confer and come up with something that all the parties agree on. I am a little skeptical about that, but open to that at least possibility. And we can talk more about it after the break, I guess.
Okay, well, I certainly have emphasized I want this to keep moving forward, but I do have concerns about you correcting an old version of the model and then CalAm presents a new version of the model, because then I obviously have two different things to work with. So and maybe once you see your corrections, your technical people could then carry them forward to the new model. But I do understand these are very extensive model files, but I hope that's fairly clear. I'd rather hear about your corrections to their new model, because if you correct their old model, they're going to say, well, we changed that, and that's no longer an issue.
To be clear, we are talking about making modifications to the 2022 model, in case that wasn't clear.
But what I'm hearing, and maybe I'm missing something here from Mr. Osias, but I'm hearing there's basically going to be a 2023 model. Maybe it won't be tremendously different from 22, but it's going to be different. Isn't that right, Mr. Osias?
Well, if you judge it by whether there's a difference or not, I don't know. We're going to run new scenarios or sensitivities or parameter changes as discussed to see what the outcome is and address the relationship between all of that and quantified results from analytics and the relationship to the new world in all the areas that we've touched on: calibration, K values. I can't do it all from my head.
No.
And I think
I get it.
I think what Mr. Wilkins is saying, not just so you can go to your break, is they want to do the same thing at the same time. Is that correct, Mr. Wilkins?
Is that correct, Mr. Wilkins?
Essentially, yes. I have a feeling we might do some different things, but yes.
Same parameters, perhaps different adjustments.
Right.
So am I missing something here, Mr. Wilkins? But doesn't that end up with a mishmash then, as opposed if you take their new files and then make your adjustments to those?
Well, I think let's take a couple examples. We think it's really important to move the southern boundary. I know you've heard something about that, and I don't want to testify, but we don't think that the regional model is particularly well calibrated within the Monterey subbasin area, and so we think it's important to change that boundary condition. Dr. Kincaid and Ms. Nelson can explain how we would do that and what we propose. and I think you heard Dr. Ye state that he didn't think that the drop in the aquitard was consistent with real world or the hydrostratigraphy that Calam believed existed within the model domain. We obviously feel very differently, and we presented evidence on that. So I think it's very likely we would adjust the model layer thicknesses. And then at the end of the day, we may add a separation at some level for the 180-foot aquifer, but we would come back with a calibrated version. It would be different than what Calam came back with. I will be very upfront that we would be doing it on a steady state version of the model, as opposed to a transient version of the model. And we can certainly talk about what that means and why we think it's still a better tool to evaluate things. But we think it's important that you see what we believe would be a more accurate representation. Not a variable density model is what we've been saying for the last 10 years needed to be done, but at least the best what we can do with what tools we have at this moment. So again, I feel I'm testifying, and I really don't want to do that. So I would like to have Dr. Kincaid and Ms. Nelson explain what we would propose to do after the break.
Okay, yeah, well, you're not I mean, if all you're saying is what you're proposing to do, that's not really testimony, so don't worry about that. It's not something I'm going to base a finding on. What you propose to do there won't be findings on that. But okay, so maybe I hate to tell you to wait, because I don't want you to wait, because then we're going to be into March before we know it. So maybe that makes sense. And I guess at the end of the day, we're going to have a table of, here's Calam's latest modeling work, here's Marina Coast's, and hopefully collaboration with City of Marina modeling work. Here are the differences. Here's why each party believes what they did is appropriate. And then here are the differences in the results. And then in my report, draft report first, and then final report, I can discuss that. I can provide my evaluation of that. And then, wait just a sec, something went. And then, talk about the different results. And then that's certainly for the court to review my evaluation and decide what the judge thinks. So go ahead, Mr. Loeffler.
So I just want to make a preliminary comment on this, that I think it's important to note that the steady state model that's been developed, and we'll address this more in our work coming up for January, it's not the same model as what we've done. We've done a transient model, both the regional and the North Marina model. It has as its core basis 50 years of hydrology, meaning we've looked at 50 years of rainfall and stream flow and incorporated that into our predictive simulations. The use of 10 years of data to develop the steady state model you don't necessarily get the same results. I'll just kind of make that as an overview statement, and we're evaluating that further. But we really are talking about, just from the outset, two different models. And now we're talking about making changes to these two different models. And we already have a situation where basically the representation of what is in the transient model through use of the steady state model is not necessarily accurate.
And I'll just say from, and I certainly, we don't need to hear it now. I don't necessarily want to hear it now, but I have some real concerns about using a steady state model instead of a transient model. I mean, just from my very simple mind, it obviously doesn't model I'm going to say month to month and year to year hydrologic variability, which seems to me could be important. Or maybe I don't understand this that well, but that does raise a concern from my point of view. I think I may have worn you all out. I don't see any hands up right now. here's what I'd like to do. I mean, this is very important to me, obviously. I hope I'm being clear that my goal is ultimately to have either one, ideally would be one modeling effort, but if necessary, two. Then I can present in my report, here's where the parties agree and here's where they disagree. And here are the results, from if they're two different modeling efforts, here are the results and where they differ and so forth. But it's going to be hard for me to evaluate basically who's right and who's wrong on these different modeling assumptions and model parameters. I mean, maybe at the end of the day, that's what we have to do. I mean, that's what, this is a technical case and that's what we need to do. But obviously that's very hard. So the more areas of agreement and the fewer areas of disagreement, the better, obviously. So that's sort of where I am. And I do hope there will be further consideration of, to the extent the expert witnesses can meet, to try to go over this and try to resolve things. I mean, you're all very qualified technical people, and with good training, good experience, and so forth. So I would hope there'd be more grounds for agreement than not. But I want to do this. I think I would like to spend a little more time on this and get all of your thoughts a little bit more, because I'm going to be sending you away for over a month of work, probably going to ruin a lot of holidays here. But I want to give you as much direction as I can, or at least as much input as I can, so that your work is as focused and as efficient as it can be over the next month. So that's why I want to spend the time with this now. So let me do this. I want to check the comments from my technical folks and then get back to you and let you know if they have any additional comments that I would like you to consider. And let's do that. And then I'd like you all to spend some time thinking about this, talking amongst, everyone on your team, the attorneys and the technical experts, so that, I think, I've thrown out some issues here. And I'd like to get back one more time before we take our leave for December. So we'll come back after the break. Why don't you all talk internally in the meantime and see where you are. And then I guess the immediate question is, if we're coming back again, would you prefer to come back tomorrow or Friday? And if so, morning or afternoon? I currently have a schedule conflict Friday afternoon, but I could meet either tomorrow morning, tomorrow afternoon, or Friday morning. So be thinking about that and let me know how much time you would like to have before we meet again. But I would like to have one more workshop session like this during this week, so we can try to firm this up a little. So with that, let's take a break until, oh shoot, I'm going to say I don't think 15 minutes is quite enough. Let's take a break until 3:50, that's 19 minutes, and come back then and see where we are. And just as a reminder, please make sure to mute your microphone and turn off your camera, particularly if you're going to have internal discussions, so we can't all hear them, but don't log off. And then we'll come back at 3:50 and see where we are. So let's do that. Thank you.
Welcome back, Siobhan. We understand that Mr. Newnecker has a 4 p.m. bowling league apparently every week.
It's the championship, David.
Good.
Okay, we're back. Sorry for the delay. Our internal discussion took a little longer than I had thought.
So, Mr. Lilly, sorry to interrupt, but I see that my colleague Siobhan is on the line, so I'm going to sign off for the day.
All right, thank you, Mr. Newdecker. We'll be back soon, but please check with Ms. Henry regarding when our next meeting is. I think it's going to be tomorrow afternoon.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Have a good day.
Mr. Lilly, also on a similar front, Mr. Betts had to leave for a I'm not actually, I don't even know why, but he sent me a note saying he had to leave and he left.
Knowing
So-
Mr. Betts, it was probably some other work assignment. I'm just kidding, but
So in any event, knowing Mr. Betts, it would have had to been extremely important. for him to not attend. And I know you were teasing, but I wanted you to note his absence.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to probably wrap up pretty quickly today. I'll tell you what my plan is. This is probably seems like it's horribly inefficient to all of you, but I don't know how better to proceed here. And I do want to try to get some direction. You can see where I want to go. I want to ultimately be able to answer the court's questions, and I'd like to have as good of modeling work, ideally one consensus modeling package, but if not, two that are as close as possible to one another, and explanations for why they're different and how those differences manifest themselves in the results. So let me just tell you what we talked about internally. First of all, regarding the gradient versus changes in, I'll just say, assumed or modeled ag well pumping in the pressure area, I still feel more comfortable with inputting changes into the regional model to basically in changes in ag well pumping, and maybe it ends up getting to the same result. I'm now understand why the 50% pumping reduction was done, and frankly, it sounds like that is similar to changing the boundary conditions in the North Marina groundwater model to get a zero gradient. So as I say, I'm more comfortable with the former, but if MCWD wants to explain why they think they need to do the latter, if they still do, that's okay when they do their modeling work. Again, I'd like to have as few differences between these two modeling packages as possible. That seems to be sort of one boundary for what we're saying is estimates of Sigma implementation, and then the other boundary is some reduction in groundwater pumping and some flattening of the gradient from current conditions. So I don't know whether that ends up being the 30% pumping reduction scenario or something else, but I would like to bracket. I'd like to have an existing condition scenario with and without project, and then these other two scenarios with and without project. So we end up with 6 scenarios as CalAm had before, but hopefully bracketing potential ramifications of Sigma implementation as well as anybody can today, and documentation of why you've made those assumptions. So, and again, if both parties can reach agreement on whether to do this through changes in the regional groundwater models, assumed reductions in agricultural pumping versus just modifying the boundary conditions to change the gradient. I'd rather, if you can reach agreement on both doing it the same way, that would be one place where I think you could avoid an unnecessary area of disagreement. I don't think it ends up being a huge difference in the results. Which way you do that. The other thing is, I'll just say, talking with my technical people, I'm going to tell CalAm this. They have some real concerns about having the southern boundary of the North Marina groundwater model so close to the Marina Coast Water District wells. And I don't know how hard it is to change, to basically expand the model domain of the North Marina model to the south. But considering that the most critical issue in this proceeding is the interactions between the CalAm pumping of its proposed slant wells and the MCWD wells and pumping of those wells, I'll just say that they have concerns about that model boundary being so close, and I'd like you to at least consider that. I mean, I understand what Mr. Durbin said about the CalAm pumping is put into the regional model, but as he said, it just doesn't have the same level of precision as, nothing wrong with it. It was a regional model, but that lower level of precision could end up creating issues for this critical issue of the interactions between the wells. So on those two things, those are my comments. The one thing I did not hear anything about that I think is really important, and I'd like to hear input from the parties, is the issue of how recharge is modeled. And as I understand it, the North Marina groundwater model currently models recharge through simulated injections through wells. I don't know whether they're actual wells or just modeled wells. And as I understand it, the amounts are from the regional model, whereas Marina Coast and City Marina have argued that there is a recharge package that can be used to, I say, more accurately simulate recharge into the North Marina groundwater model domain area. So starting, does anybody from CalAm want to comment on this question of recharge and whether or not CalAm proposes to make changes in how recharge is going to be simulated? So maybe Mr. Leffler, Mr. Durbin, or Dr. Ye, does one of you want to comment on that?
So let me just start if I can, and then let them fill in.
Okay, go ahead.
This is Mr. Asias.
I see you. Go ahead, Mr. Asias.
Okay, so your question had two parts. One is sort of recharge as a topic to evaluate, maybe vary and test. And then the other is the how to do it in the model. Your comments just now are more about, I think, how to do it, recharge package versus simulated injection wells. So I think what I'm reporting, I always try to do this, is accurate, but I think Dr. Kincaid, who's still with us, said he didn't think it was wrong to do it through the injection wells, or necessarily that it produced a different result. It's just harder to review or modify and manipulate without the recharge package. I think that was said.
Okay, so why don't you just stop right there, since Dr. Kincaid is right there. And I understand we'll talk second about whether the values are right, but do you agree with what Mr. Asias just said, Dr. Kincaid, or not? Go off mute though, too. Uh-oh, I hope you're not forced on the mute. I'll ask my staff if they can unmute you. You may have, I had this problem myself. So team, please unmute Dr. Kincaid if you can. There you
Thank
go.
you.
Now go ahead.
Actually, I was having a problem with my mouse not being able to get to the unmute button. I don't know why.
We can hear you now. Go ahead.
Of course, it happens. Yes, I mean, it is used, they use the assigned recharge through the use of wells I presume, based on my reading of the report, to translate recharge that was assigned in the regional model and to transfer that into the North Marina model. So it is more difficult to evaluate because in that way. But more important to me is that I don't believe that recharge should be a fixed parameter. I believe that the amount of recharge going into the model should be part of the calibration effort, such that recharge should be varied within reason, obviously, but that variations in recharge could be used to help achieve calibration, again, such that reliance on hydraulic conductivities could be relaxed. So
okay, well, that's important.
Clarifies that. And then, and as to whether it's, there are obviously differences. I mean, the recharge package was developed so that it would better approximate an aerial distribution of recharge as opposed to focusing it as small mounds of water being injected at wells. But either way, you get the water into the model. So the main point that I have is that I believe very strongly that recharge is known well enough to have it be a fixed parameter, and that some variation in recharge external to what Mr. Durbin found is warranted here so that we could incorporate that into the effort to achieve calibration.
Okay, well, thank you. And again, we don't need to spend a lot of time talking about recharge today, but I will note that I think one of the figures, I think it was from Dr. Kincaid, showed that in some of the parts of the model domain near the ocean, the recharge was only on the order of 1 or 2 inches per year, which just intuitively seemed low to me when I think the average rainfall in this area is 16 inches per year. So any other comments from any of the CalAm modelers on this? Dr. Ye, go ahead. Tell us your thoughts about this issue of recharge and how it's modeled.
Yes, yeah. That slide you see was based on the category of hydraulic conductivity. But the recharge here is the deep percolation from precipitation and return flow from applied water. So, that category just that recharge is a function of land use. So if you have if it's a agricultural use, urban use, or open space, they're different. So it's not a function of hydraulic conductivity. That's first of all. Secondly, that number was based on the average for the period from 2004 to 2013. It's not a representative period for the entire 50-year hydrology we used. So if we add that, actually double that. Lastly, that number didn't include the return flow from Armstrong Range we put in the model. So actually, if you add that, it's like 3 inch. So the entire North Marina groundwater model domain, the average recharge was simulated based on the regional model using the soil moisture budget model. I think it's around 3.7 inch per year. This number is very similar to the Monterey subbasin GSP model used. It's a 3.9 inch per year for that model domain. And I think in that GSP model report say that number is reasonable. And also based on our modeling experience in various groundwater basins, that number is a reasonable number.
And what is your response to Dr. Kincaid's comments that it's appropriate to vary the modeled recharge as part of the model calibration process?
So that reasonable number, usually we don't change that during the model calibration. But certainly we can do some sensitivity run to evaluate, some effects on that.
Okay, well, I think that is worth doing. Again, this is really beyond my expertise, way beyond my expertise. But Dr. Kincaid said that one of the things he said was that some variation in recharge as part of the calibration process may, I'll say, reduce the need to have the hydraulic conductivity numbers vary as much and in ways that he said potentially could deviate from what was geologically made sense and also the large variations from area to area. So again, you don't need to answer that now, but I would like you to at least consider, to the extent varying recharge in the calibration process may alleviate this concern about having to have such different hydraulic conductivities over different parts of the model domain. I think it's particularly in layer 2 that this is a concern. So anyway, please consider that, Dr. Ye, as you go forward.
Okay, thanks.
I thank you. You can take your hand down, but thank you. Okay, so on the going down on my notes, my staff's note
Mr. Lilly?
on Mr. Osias's outline, but go ahead, Mr. Osias.
No, I was just going to go back to, because you asked an important question about the southern domain.
Oh, okay,
And
yeah,
it being close. And I think there's two parts to the question, at least implicitly, which is, can they change it and how long would it take?
yeah, it's not southern model boundary, we'll say.
Okay, so I'm sorry, southern model boundary. And it would be helpful, if possible, if you could shed any more light on what the concern is or regarding that, other than it's, I think you said it was near the MCWD wells. That's obviously, those wells are important. But now I'm asking on behalf of my experts, is there anything technical that could be shared to allow them to evaluate that concern?
Okay, so that's a fair question, and I don't want to put my technical person on the spot right
Okay.
now. We're going to come back tomorrow, but she's hearing that, and we'll note that, and we'll get back to it. I mean, I know one thing is she said normally it's better if you can have a model domain be a hydraulic boundary, but that may or may not be possible here. So beyond that, I mean, I guess your question is, okay, if it's this many feet or this many miles, how much farther should it be? So let me talk with her, and one or the other of us will speak on that when we get back. I'm planning to reconvene tomorrow afternoon. It's a fair question, and
Okay, thank you. I did.
you know, and again, we don't have the final word here. MCWD and City of Marina clearly are going to have some issues on that, and that would, I'm going to just ask you. I know it's hard to talk to other parties, but you only have one homework assignment now so far, but why don't you see if you, Mr. Osias, I'm going to ask you to take the lead since you raised it, but contact Mr. Wilkins or Mr. Brochard and ask them, is there any way we could set up a short conference call, maybe an hour, amongst the pertinent experts, at least Dr. Ye, probably Mr. Durbin, and the appropriate technical experts from MCWD, certainly Dr. Kincaid, potentially Ms. Nelson, and Dr. Trudell as well, and just see, can we reach some consensus on this? You may not be able to, but if you can, that would be very good. So can you try to do that? You were supposed to all have a hearing day tomorrow morning, so you should have it all in your calendars, and I just ask you to do that. Mr. Durbin, your hand is up. Go ahead.
In trying to for all the experts to work together, one of the constraints that limits responses is the time available to do the work. And the between now and January 16th, there's a relatively limited stuff we could do. Many of the things that I'm hearing from you that you would like, yes, they can be done, but they can't be done in that time frame.
Okay, well, I was concerned about that, and this one in particular just seems to me like it may take more time than some of the other things for extending the model domain of the North Marina groundwater model. But nevertheless, please see if you can talk this over. That's certainly a reasonable factor. If you know, if that's a reason to extend the time for the additional work, we'll talk about that as to whether or not that makes sense. I mean, I do want to move as quickly as we can, but on the other hand, I want to get this as accurate as we can too. And I realize there's some conflict between those two here, but please talk that over, and we'll come back on to that tomorrow afternoon.
So I'm going to call, just to confirm, I'm going to call Mr. Wilkins and Mr. Brochard.
One or the other, they're both attorneys for MCWD. With Mr. Wilkins, your hand is up. Which one of you do you want him to call?
I wouldn't say we're interchangeable, but he's welcome to call either of us.
I didn't say you were interchangeable. I said you were both.
No.
MCME
I
attorneys.
said I wouldn't say we're interchangeable, but he can call either of us is what I was saying. I was not commenting on what you said.
And
The one
and
thing
the
I was trying to-
the goal is to explore a call tomorrow when we thought we might otherwise be in hearing.
Yeah, why not,
That's-
when we're done today,
That's what I
just,
heard.
just,
Uh,
when we're done today, just call and set up a time when you can all talk tomorrow morning.
And we have a proposal, and I'll let Mr. Brochard say it, that we talked about during the break.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Bouchard. This
So,
is sort of
our-
freewheeling, but go ahead.
Our recommendation was to have the experts talk amongst themselves, preferably with somebody from the AHO, perhaps one of your technical staff, as kind of guiding that construction, guiding that conversation without any of the attorneys.
And
That was an important part to us. I
Okay.
don't know that conversations with attorneys are going to be fruitful at this point.
I could make some crack about attorneys, but I won't. We've heard them all. So just to clarify, Mr. Bouchard, when would that be? Is that before we get going in the modeling work, or down the road? Or when do you see that as making sense?
As soon as possible, I think would be the best course of action. I think it's a conversation that should take place about adjustments that can and should be made, and they can talk amongst themselves as to why they've made certain assumptions and how certain things have been done. I don't want to limit, what they talk about.
Okay, well, and certainly technical staff means I wouldn't be involved, which would probably be just as well. But I think that could make sense here, and I can probably volunteer Ms. Graziano to participate in that. She does have many years of groundwater modeling experience, so I don't know that she can mediate, but she can at least listen and then report back to me on what she thinks makes sense and doesn't. So, Mr. Osiris, what's your response on that? You've had a little bit more time, not much.
So I had, anticipating this question, but not anticipating the proposal, we had the following thoughts.
Go ahead.
First, the HWG sort of has worked as a team and therefore would choose to participate as a team. Second, Mr. Leffler is completely unavailable for the next 2 weeks. Not this week, obviously, but the week after and the week after. Now, many other people, I assume, will have some also time constraints in that period. 3, that the time spent plus some additional whatever that's spent meeting, a choose of time that they could be otherwise doing work, so the January 16th deadline would no longer be realistic. And 4th, or if I'm up to 4, I can't, I've lost track.
You're up to 4. Go ahead.
That it be without lawyers. And 5th, that it be under a rubric that we would treat like a settlement discussion, even though it's not really, but that nothing's reportable out of that meeting. No, he said, she said, no, you agreed during that meeting of X. Only thing gets reported out is something they agree upon in writing. Otherwise, it's so that they can speak candidly to each other and don't have to worry about who's taking better notes and who's accusing who of what.
Okay, well, you're being cautious. You're a lawyer. That's what we're trained to do. And that that does make some sense. Although frankly, that means I probably don't want my staff to be involved, because otherwise that would put Ms. Graziano in an absolutely impossible position of listening, perhaps contributing, but then not being able to tell me what she talked about. I don't want to put her in that position. So, but with those caveats, Mr. Brochard, what's your response?
If we really want to be effective and efficient, I think it would be helpful to have Ms. Graziano there to express what her concerns are as the expert from the AHO. Again, we're just trying to get, the best information possible. Why are people making the assumptions they're making? What's the support for that? I don't think Ms. Graziano being present should have much effect on anything. I don't know that any of these experts are going to come out of it saying, you know, somebody else told me X, Y, Z. I mean, they may, because they're going to be making assumptions. I assume they're going to come out of this conversation and, you know, CalAM's experts are going to move forward with making changes to the model, and we're going to have our experts move forward making changes to the model. And eventually those are going to be presented and they're going to be explaining why they made certain changes. And some of that is going to be based on conversations they've had with other experts. So I don't know how Mr. Osias's proposal would really work. You'd essentially, they'd be getting together to have discussions to make certain assumptions, but they wouldn't be able to talk about why they made those assumptions later on.
Well,
No,
no, what
Not
he's
sure.
saying is if they reach agreement, then they can report out on what they've agreed to, but if they don't reach agreement, then they wouldn't report out, well, you know, during the meeting, so-and-so said this, and now so-and-so is backing off from that. I think that's sort of what Mr. Osias is getting at. Is that right, Mr. Osias?
yes.
So, okay, well, let's do that. I mean, you know, we're brainstorming here. And
Mr.
this
Lilly,
may not be the last, just a minute, Ms. Meisenhower, I'll get to you. This may not be the last time, probably won't be the last time I ask for basically a meeting of the experts. But go ahead, Ms. Meisenhower.
thanks. It was really a point of clarification. I mean, normally in a settlement discussion, what it means is the things that are communicated during it can't be introduced at trial, right? Or used to sort of make a point or in a brief. When we're talking about restrictions about reporting out from this meeting, I'm assuming our experts could still tell us what happened, the attorneys, and sort of keep us up to speed. Or are we talking about sort of a blanket prohibition on experts sort of speaking about what happened in the expert meeting? I just want to make sure we understand the ground rules.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I was proposing,
understood
it wouldn't be reported in this hearing proceeding.
Yeah, that's the
Thank you.
former of the two things you just said. I think Mr. Osias agrees with you on that. I certainly do as well. I'm not, there's no way I can enforce what your experts talk about with you, with the attorneys, and I don't want to get involved in that, I'm sure.
Perfect. Thank you.
So, well,
One
here's-
other thought of concern, because I just heard Mr. Brochard's, proposal as we're talking. So the other thing I would say with, as I consider the idea of Ms. Graziano or another technical staff member is, I think if they're going to contribute their ideas, views, or comments, they ought to be as part of this proceeding and not in a private meeting.
Okay, yeah, at least at first, I think I'd have to agree with that. Otherwise, it puts her and me in an impossible situation, I think. So let's do this, especially since time is limited with people getting ready to look at vacation plans. I'm going to direct the attorneys, and again, Mr. Osias, why don't you contact Mr. Brochard after we're done here to work together to set up a conference call or to have your experts set up a conference call since you won't be involved, but to schedule it for tomorrow morning. You figure out the logistics. You all know how to do Zoom or Teams. And we have the list. I'm not going to go through it here. We've talked about it. Mr. Osias's outline is a good list of issues. And I'd like the technical experts, at least one for each of the three parties and more as appropriate. I don't really want to bring in people who haven't been involved in this hearing, but I think everybody who is on this hearing right now, it has a right to participate, but at least one per party. I just don't want to bring in anybody else because then it's getting him or her up to speed, which I think would be inefficient. So I'd recommend you start tomorrow morning early, like 9 at the latest, and figure you have 3 hours. And to the extent you can prepare any kind of a consensus report, or even on this issue, CalAM's position is this, MCWD and City Marina's position is this, that would be very helpful. And then let's see where we are we'll make it 1:30 tomorrow afternoon, just in case you drag on a little bit into lunch. Let's have another meeting of all of us then and see where we are for going forward. And I'll warn you, I may be calling you back on Friday because I think an investment of some time now really could make things more efficient down the road for all of us, which of course would be valuable. I'd like to have the reporting done by January 16, but if there's a good reason to delay that because it will, make for significant improvements in the modeling work, I'll certainly consider that as well. But I think that's a good way to go forward for now. And please do look, we did post all the Excel spreadsheets of all three parties' exhibit files, and they're just for each one a few exhibits that we still have to rule on. So look at that, and we'll cover that tomorrow afternoon as well. So I would like you to proceed that way. We'll see where we are. We'll plan to get back at 1:30 tomorrow afternoon. Is there anything else that we should talk about today, or can we just come back tomorrow? All right. Hearing nothing else, thank you all very much for your patience. I'm trying really hard to make progress here. I hope it seems that way. But this is hard and it's going to take some time. So with that, let's all plan to get back at 1:30 tomorrow, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thank you.